"My light, my mirror, tell me," said the woman who stood in front of a large mirror in a massive frame. "Who in the world is the fairest, the rosiest, and the whitest?" she continued to ask. Her hands touched the surface of the magic glass. The reflection of a little girl appeared on the surface of the mirror. The girl's large eyes were bright blue, and her long hair was black, and the mirror replied that in the whole world, the most beautiful, the rosiest, and the whitest of all was Princess Blanche Friedkin. This answer caused a fit of rage in the woman standing in front of the mirror. And what made her even more furious was the face of the girl with innocent blue eyes. The woman looked at the reflections, unable to look away. She struck the surface of the mirror with a powerful blow. Then she swung and hit again and again. Choking from helplessness, the woman leaned her hands against the mirror. But then she raised her head and looked at the frightened girl with blue eyes differently. An ominous laugh escaped her lips, and then another, and another. Everything was as expected, because Blanche was the most beautiful in the world. Her name was Liebeck Hap. She always loved beautiful, cute, and charming things, so she dreamed of living the life of a fairy tale princess, but in reality, she was a very ordinary person. She compensated for this by becoming a children's clothing designer and was happy because she could transform little girls into elegant princesses. Ms. Beck Hap was found in the break room and found not even breathing. The staff called an ambulance, but it was too late. At the age of 30, Liebeck Hap died from overwork in the office. If she had foreseen this, she would not have fasted as a diet. But when she opened her eyes after death, she became this beautiful, stunning, cruel villain. Abigail Friedkin was Snow White's stepmother. That was the story. Princess Blanche was the same Snow White, the girl now sitting in front of Abigail. Liebeck Hap looked at her and wondered how someone like that could even exist in this world. Snow White skin, doll-like face, shiny ebony hair, large deep blue eyes. Liebeck Hap would have been perfectly happy if Blanche had worn clothes of her design. The beauty of this girl made the woman, who had died from overwork, want to take up a pencil again, to make this girl her muse. Blanche looked at her stepmother and asked what she had done wrong. Abigail exclaimed that nothing of the sort. She just wanted to have tea with her stepdaughter. That's why she invited her. Liebeck Han realized that with Abigail's face, she'd better not smile anymore. Although her face was very beautiful, she always smiled very creepily. This was the essence of the villain's personality. She could only come to terms with it, based on Abigail's vague, periodically emerging memories. Besides this murderous smile, there were other reasons for Blanche's fear. It was perfectly normal for Abigail, who was extremely obsessed with beauty, to drive away or torment all the beautiful women in the area, and Princess Blanche was certainly subjected to bullying from her, both serious and not so serious. Abigail smashed dishes and yelled at those around her not to dare neglect her. She shouted to the courtiers and maids that she was disgusted, that she had ordered things to be done so that she would not have to deal with this child, and demanded that Blanche leave immediately. It's hard to imagine the fear of a stepmother who torments her to death and then almost kills her. Unfortunately, once in Abigail's body, Liebeck Han couldn't afford to worry about Blanche alone, because at this rate, she herself would meet a bad end like in a fairy tale. If she wasn't mistaken, she was forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dropped dead. Whether Abigail died or was saved depended on Blanche, so Liebeck Han saw improving their relationship as her top priority. "Princess Blanche!" she called out to the frightened, frozen girl. She wanted to explain that she was truly sorry. She felt guilty for all this time when she tormented the girl, and now she would like to express her regrets to the princess. Blanche looked at her silently with her bottomless blue eyes, which she finally said hesitantly. Abigail explained that after returning from the other world, she regretted a lot of things. She admitted that an apology couldn't erase everything she had done, but she still wanted to tell Blanche, who was nervously crumpling the folds of her dress, that she was sorry. The girl shrank even more and lowered her head. Abigail looked at her own face reflected in her cup of tea. This cold appearance definitely suited the villain. But it was completely incomprehensible why a woman so beautiful was so envious of the child. Abigail decided to try again and apologized to Blanche for scaring her so much. Seeing that the girl continued to be afraid, Abigail said that she did not need to force herself, she could go and rest. After these words, the girl immediately jumped up from her seat. She made a respectful curtsy and wished Her Majesty the Queen a good rest. Liebeck Hap watched this scene with affection and tenderness. As Blanche turned to run, she collided with a man entering the room. She stepped back with a cry of astonishment. The girl stumbled and fell to the floor. "Princess Blanche!" Abigail cried in alarm, also jumping up from her seat. She hurried to ask if the girl was hurt and if she was okay. Blanche replied that she was fine and winced, clutching her arm. Abigail rushed to her, lamenting that she didn't know what to do, because the girl was in pain. She had hurt her hand. Blanche assured her in a trembling voice that she was okay. "How inattentive," a stern voice sounded above them both. Then the order was given to call the family doctor. The man who entered the room said that he needed to talk to the queen about something, and he told Blanche to leave. Lee Baek-han knew this man. It was the ruler of the kingdom of Nergen, Blanche's father and Abigail's husband, Civilian Friedkin. If Lee Baek-han had to describe her briefly, she would say that he is just very handsome trash. She looked into his eyes and said that he was so heartless. His little daughter was hurt, and he found it difficult to say even a few kind words. Civilian said it sounded interesting. He hadn't noticed when Abigail had suddenly become so tender and caring towards Blanche. Abigail responded that it was a fair point, but that returning from the dead had changed her outlook on life. "Well, that's how it is," Civilian said indifferently, making Abigail want to punch him in the lips at least once. Civilian was a wise and strong king with refined features, but he was so indifferent that it seemed as if it was not blood that flowed through his veins, but a frozen river. At the wedding banquet, which was only possible due to a political agreement between the countries, he left his wife alone, citing fatigue. And on their wedding night, he declared that he would never touch the queen's body, no matter what. He said this to Abigail and then fell asleep. Civilian simply refused the most beautiful flower of the kingdom of Kroenberg, Abigail, whom all men desired. Her inflated pride was hurt and turned into a real obsession with her husband. She was desperate to know what the hell she should do. She wanted to know what she had to do to please him. But Civilian said she didn't have to do anything. She was supposed to not say anything to him or even come close to him. All he wanted from her was to act as if she didn't exist. One such day, Abigail died, and the first words he spoke to her as she lay in the coffin after the exchange of souls sounded cruel. "Let's never meet in the next life," he told her. Lee Baek-han wanted to know what it was like. How could one behave like that? Even though it was a political marriage without love, even though Abigail was a villain, the instigator of all these tragedies was he, Civilian. He asked if anything was bothering the queen, as she did not have a very good expression on her face. Abigail muttered through her teeth that the tea was very hot, while at the same time thinking that he was a damn instigator and a bastard. She asked why he was looking for her. Civilian said he wanted to talk about her death. The cause of death is under investigation, but it has been suggested that it could be due to poison, which disappears over time and leaves no trace. The poison meant that Abigail had been deliberately killed. Civilian replied that he had not performed an autopsy or personally examined the body, so it was all inaccurate, and moreover, there was no evidence either. He spoke of the autopsy with such a regretful tone that Abigail thought the local genre must be a thriller. Civilian asked if the queen still did not remember what happened before her death. Abigail looked at him, then immediately looked down and said that, unfortunately, the memories never came back to her. Civilian decided to remind his wife of the time she drank poison and lost consciousness, which happened about 6 months ago. Eventually, when Abigail was exposed, she admitted that she simply wanted to get her husband's attention. He wanted to know if exactly the same thing had happened now. "Would I sacrifice my life?" Abigail cried. She even let out a nervous laugh, but thought that perhaps the woman she was could have done something like that. She had always been faking it, drinking poison, falling into the lake, just to arouse interest in herself. But now a completely different person would have to deal with all of this. She screamed that no, this time it was completely different. No one would die just to attract someone's attention. Besides, it was obvious that in this case, she would be the first to fall under suspicion, so she didn't need something like that. Civilian didn't look like he would believe these words. Lee Baek-han had never been good at persuading. Civilian said that Abigail could do whatever she wanted, but she would never get what she wanted from him, so he would appreciate it if she would stop trying to wear him down now. "No," Abigail said. Lee Baek-han didn't understand what it was and who was saying it now. Well, her predecessor in this body had managed to do a lot of things. She was ready to admit the mistake she had made out loud and fully understood why Civilian was saying that. However, she was ready to assure him that she no longer needed his attention. "What?" Civilian asked again, perplexed. He couldn't understand why she had suddenly changed so much. Abigail replied that it was all pointless. No matter how much she begged her husband for love, she only received sympathy. She didn't need that. She had thought carefully about everything that had happened so far and had come up with one proposal that she now wanted to make to Civilian. "Offer," Civilian repeated nervously. Abigail chuckled as she watched his reaction. She suggested that they should live completely separately from each other from now on. Even the woman's suggestion of separate rooms was unexpected for Civilian, and she happily asked what he would say to this, because it was hard for Lee Baek-han to sleep and wake up in the same bed with a stranger every day, and even harder to be nervous every time and see nightmares at night. So if Civilian agreed, it would be wonderful, the only way for their further existence together. Civilian said that he understood everything. He would order a separate sleeping place to be prepared for Abigail. Abigail said she would consider that an acceptance of her proposal, but she asked permission to ask Civilian one more thing. What else? Civilian said. Abigail replied that she would no longer demand that he act as her husband, but she wanted him to take the role of father responsibly, and that was her request. The role of the father, Civilian clarified coldly. Yes, Abigail answered, and explained that he no longer wished to have heirs, so he was supposed to love and protect at least the child he had. After all, Blanche was his only daughter, so she needed to be protected even more. Yes, that's right, this is my child, Civilian interrupted her excited speech. He stated that it was his thing, not something belonging to Abigail, so he would deal with it himself. A thing, Abigail repeated his words indignantly. This man calls his child and considers him just a thing. She simply had no words for it. Abigail's hands slammed down on the table. Jumping up, she declared that her interlocutor seemed to have completely forgotten that her name was Abigail Friedkin, and that she was the same Friedkin as Civilian and Blanche. This gave her the right to take at least such a part. Abigail and Civilian's gazes met. Abigail demanded that he treat Princess Blanche with love. It was her only request of this man. Having said all this, she was about to take her leave. Civilian watched in bewilderment as the woman turned around abruptly, her blonde curls flying. "Oh yes," Abigail said suddenly, pausing for a moment at the door. She said that she would prefer to begin living separately from today. The palace maids discussed the fact that Her Majesty had settled into a separate room. The red-haired maid told Madame Norma that it was true, and that the Queen herself had given her permission. Lady Norma would like to know what Her Majesty has in mind this time. The red-haired maid asked again what Madame Norma meant, since the king and queen stopped living together due to strained relations. Norma winced at the suggestion. The red-haired maid looked at her interlocutor with a questioning expression on her face. Norma said that Clara was completely new here and therefore didn't know anything, but one shouldn't think so lightly about the queen. When she's in a bad mood, she takes her anger out on the maids, so you have to be careful with your words. It is also unacceptable to wear even small jewelry. You should dress modestly. Therefore, Clara had better take off her earrings right now. Norma thought that this girl wouldn't last here even a couple of days. There was a bell ringing, and Norma said that it was the queen ringing, so they had to hurry. Abigail stood by the window, waiting for the maids. Both women bowed respectfully before her and asked if Her Majesty had called them. Abigail replied that she wanted to ask them something. "Yes, Your Majesty," Norma responded, certain that she was simply wanting to throw a tantrum about something again. "There," Abigail said, pointing in front of her. There were some baby shoes in front of her, and she wanted to ask which pair of shoes would best suit Princess Blanche. The shoes were quite an unexpected occasion, and the maids wondered why Her Majesty wanted to give Princess Blanche a gift. Perhaps she wanted to put a button or a needle in them. But the most important thing for Norma herself now was to answer. "Both," she finally said. Clara was quick to express her opinion and said that both pairs would be perfect for Princess Blanche. Norma glanced sideways in horror at the red-haired girl, because of whom it was now the end for both of them, because Her Majesty would certainly spank them. Abigail agreed that both pairs would suit the princess, which is why she couldn't choose between them. Clara suggested simply giving both. The princess would definitely be happy. Abigail asked if this would be a burden to Blanche, but Clara replied that there was nothing to fear, and upon hearing this, Norma thought that perhaps the queen really was just choosing a gift. Abigail asked Norma what she thought. Since she had such a serious expression on her face, Clara assumed that Mrs. Norma simply could not make up her mind either. "No," Norma muttered, trying to find an answer. "The princess will definitely be happy too," she finally said. A bright crescent moon was visible through the large window. The girl stood by the window and looked at the night sky. It was Princess Blanche. A sigh escaped her chest. In the morning, someone singing without words was heard in the castle. It was Clara, dusting the furniture, humming something under her breath. Another girl asked her why she was in such a good mood. Clara wondered dreamily if she didn't look gorgeous today. Didn't she glow? If you look closely, that's exactly what happened, and there was something strange flying around her. Clara explained that Her Majesty had allowed the maids to dress as they wished, so she, of course, immediately bought a new dress. And new sapphire earrings sparkled in the girl's ears. Her Majesty said that she had been thinking about getting rid of them for a long time. She had too many of them, so she allowed them to be sorted. Until now, Clara had heard only bad things about Her Majesty, so she was very, very, very nervous. But it turned out that the Queen is very kind and good. The second maid said that, to be honest, she also received a brooch, but she didn't know for sure whether she was allowed to accept such a gift. Clara said that everything was fine because the Queen herself had given it to her. Mrs. Norma listened attentively to the girls' conversation. She thought that the Queen was acting as if she had become a completely different person. She told Norma that she understood how guilty she felt towards her because it had been very difficult with her all this time. Norma wondered if the Queen had really changed. "Clara," Abigail said to the red-haired maid. She asked if today was the day for fitting dresses for Princess Blanche, and Clara confirmed it. New outfits for Blanche. Abigail was so eager to see them all. She already imagined how the girl would look in different images. She wanted to put this and that on her, dress her up and admire her uncontrollably. But Abigail understood that the girl herself would hardly be happy if she came. She would rather be scared. Clara asked if it wasn't wonderful, as Her Majesty had just prepared a gift for the princess, and for Abigail these words were the last straw. She jumped up, knocking over her cup of tea. With a grin, she told the maid to help her get ready to go out. Clara beamed and replied that, of course. Civilian sat at the table, pondering over the papers. The man who entered the office asked if His Majesty was perhaps unwell and should come back later, but Civilian replied that he was fine, and that for the first time since the wedding he had slept deeply all night, so he was now in the best of health. Then his interlocutor asked what was troubling His Majesty. "How can I say that?" Civilian said. He was haunted by the behavior, which he saw for the first time. "What?" exclaimed his interlocutor. "Milord," cried Civilian, jumping up. He ordered his assistant to carefully observe the Queen for some time and report everything to him. Milord replied that he understood everything. At this time, a lot of outfits were brought into another room. Blanche sat and watched what was happening with her huge blue eyes. Abigail looked only at her. She thought that Blanche's cuteness was still deadly dangerous today. If the director saw this, he would have offered her an exclusive contract right then and there. Oh, how happy Abigail would have been if Blanche wore things of her design. But now she was her mother. She could not hesitate. She could simply force the girl to wear them, so she was a truly successful fan. The merchant showed off the outfits and asked Madame Jeremy's opinion. Madame Jeremy was Blanche's governess and tutor. She said that the outfits on display were not bad and asked to see others, which caused indignation in Abigail, who was peeping through the crack in the door, because these were outfits for Blanche. This auntie was not choosing outfits for herself. Abigail didn't understand what the hell was going on. All these dresses were equally unsuitable. These were all styles for adults. Clothing for children and adults differs dramatically because children's skin is delicate and their bodies are constantly growing, so clothing for them must be comfortable and not restrict movement. However, several centuries ago, such features were completely ignored. Children simply wore smaller versions of adult outfits and were even forced to wear high heels and corsets. Now that Liebeck Happ had seen with her own eyes what she had previously read about in books, she was simply speechless, but she had to endure it. To begin with, it was necessary to focus only on design. This was a great chance to learn about Blanche's preferences, and later she would sew very comfortable clothes for her sister. No, her daughter. Meanwhile, a new dress was placed in front of Blanche, and she was asked how she liked it. Abigail noticed that the girl liked it. "No, it won't fit. Bring another design," said Madame Jeremy. Blanche immediately visibly drooped. The tailor said that if that was the case, he could offer a design that was currently in fashion. Abigail was shocked when she saw this dress. The tailor proudly presented this parrot outfit. Blanche's face reflected all the horror she had experienced. Madame Jeremy said it would be just right. Abigail simply couldn't believe what was happening. "Madame Jeremy," Blanche murmured timidly. The governess asked what had happened to the princess. The girl squeezed her own skirt tightly and replied that nothing. The merchant noted that there was another dress that had recently become popular among young ladies in neighboring countries. A similar style would soon be fashionable in this kingdom as well, so it would be worth taking a look at. Blanche's eyes widened and sparkled as she looked up at another dress mannequin. This dress was too cute, even for Abigail's taste. Abigail was also delighted that Blanche liked the outfit. It would suit her perfectly. No, Madame Jeremy said suddenly, and noted that the dress would not suit Her Highness. She was going to order only what they had already chosen earlier. The merchant said that he understood everything. They would prepare the chosen clothes to the princess's proportions as soon as possible. Oh no, Abigail thought in her hiding place. That pink dress was made for their beloved Blanche. She wished that her aunt would return it immediately. Couldn't she see that the child was about to burst into tears? Couldn't she sense that sad aura at all? Abigail just couldn't take it anymore. But she was obliged to endure all this further. Surrendering to her emotions, Abigail slammed both doors open. "Your Majesty," cried the frightened Blanche. Everyone present in the room was astonished by the Queen's sudden appearance. "Welcome, Your Majesty," said Madame Jeremy, bowing. "Ah, welcome, Your Majesty," Blanche said, curtsying. Abigail looked ahead with a stern expression. She said she had heard that the tailor had come for Princess Blanche's spring dresses, and she now wanted to know how everything was going. Madame Jeremy replied that they had just finished. Abigail looked carefully at all the chosen outfits. She did not see among them the very dress that Blanche had liked. The governess and the girls stood before the Queen with incomprehensible expressions on their faces. Abigail asked Princess Blanche which of these dresses she liked best. The girl looked at her and said that she liked them all. So that's how it is, Abigail thought. Of course, the girl simply could not speak openly. The violet eyes darted around. She was looking out for something carefully. There was definitely a box around here somewhere. "Ah," she said when she finally found it. "Ah," repeated Madame Jeremy, watching her. Abigail lifted the lids of the boxes and looked inside. She asked Clara if she could help her get it. Abigail said that she personally found the two dresses very lovely. She asked what the princess thought about this. "Oh," cried Blanche, hastening to assure that she thought these dresses were beautiful. Abigail thoughtfully realized that the princess definitely liked some of the other outfits. She noticed how nervous Blanche was acting, even though she was trying to hide her emotions. Abigail turned her head, trying to find which ones the girl liked, and she couldn't remember. Blanche looked at her stepmother with wide, frightened eyes. The girl's expression suddenly changed, striking Abigail to the depths of her soul. The Queen's gaze became completely insane. Abigail wrung her hands in a fit of raging emotion. She punched the wall with all her might, denting it. Something crunched under her blows. Everyone present looked at Abigail, completely confused. She thought it was all cute, and ordered all the dresses that were there to be altered to fit the princess. She was going to buy them all. Abigail announced that the payment would be a one-time payment. Madame Jeremy cleared her throat into a clenched fist. She asked the Queen not to consider this as insolence. She reminded that Her Majesty cannot order all of this on the budget allocated to the princess. Abigail asked again, didn't she say that she would pay for everything? Because she had all the royal rights to it? She would pay from her budget, so there would be no shortage. The two women's gazes met, expressing each other's attitude without words. Suddenly, someone tugged at Abigail's skirt, and she looked down to where Blanche's thin voice was addressing Her Majesty. "Princess?" Abigail said, enchanted, looking into the girl's huge blue eyes. Blanche assured that she was fine, that she did not want Her Majesty to be unable to buy dresses for herself because of her. Abigail looked at this child with affection. She squatted down so that her and Blanche's faces were on the same level, and, looking the girl in the eyes, said that everything was fine. She had plenty of clothes, so she was not going to buy herself any more. "But still, of course," Blanche muttered. Abigail asked the girl if she would fulfill one request in return. "Oh," cried Blanche, and then assured her that she would do whatever Her Majesty desired. She asked that when the dresses arrived, Blanche should put on the one she liked best and come to Abigail. "And that's all?" the girl asked again in surprise. "Of course, that's enough," Abigail replied, and thought about what else she would like to photograph as a keepsake. "Then it was time to take my leave," Abigail said. It was only then that she remembered what she wanted to say to Princess Blanche. Abigail said she brought the shoes as a gift, and in fact, she had come specifically to give them away. "Oh," Blanche exclaimed in amazement, "there were so many boxes." Abigail said she just wanted to see the girl in those new shoes, and in return she had to make sure to show up in them later. "Your Majesty," Blanche muttered, stunned. Abigail asked everyone to forgive her. Accompanied by Clara, they headed towards the exit from the princess's chambers. "Oh, Your Majesty, take care of yourself," was the parting word that sounded after them. Abigail walked away resolutely. She thought she hadn't even noticed how she had flown in. Her heart almost stopped. But she probably didn't say anything too strange. Maybe she seemed too rude, because she couldn't make more enemies for herself, because she couldn't get killed because of this. But nothing special seemed to have happened, and Blanche even laughed. Yes, the girl was not afraid, and called Abigail so touchingly. "Your Majesty," she suddenly heard this voice. It was Blanche, who ran as fast as she could down the corridor, calling for Her Majesty. "Blanche!" Abigail exclaimed in surprise, looking at her. She couldn't understand what had happened, that the princess had run away like that. Blanche suddenly felt embarrassed about the reason for running, looked down and muttered what Abigail had told her about the shoes. She looked into the queen's eyes with frightened hope, and she sighed. Covering her mouth with her hands, the girl suddenly burst out laughing. She exclaimed that she was indeed very, very glad, and then thanked Her Majesty. Abigail was delighted with the princess's childish smile. Looking at her, she felt a very warm and slightly tickling feeling, as if spring had come and white flowers had blossomed. Madame Jeremy finally caught up with her charge and shouted to her that the princess needed to be measured. Blanche looked back and said she thought she should go. She bowed to Abigail, who thought that in this strange and troubled place she had never felt anything like this before. Blanche's warm smile, as if seen for the first time since Abigail's birth, was the first to embrace her. Could she even think about it? Clara asked worriedly if Her Majesty needed to call a doctor, because for some time she had not looked very well, as if surrounded by a dark aura. But Abigail felt the happiest in the world now, but now she will definitely never smile if it causes such reactions. She couldn't help it. A smile would appear on her face whenever she thought of their sweet Blanche. She so wanted to make a dress for her herself. But it was still too early to make this wish come true. Now Blanche will definitely wear even that clown rainbow dress if she gets it as a gift. The girl said that she likes everything. Abigail tried to understand what kind of child first learns not to be capricious, but to watch the reactions of adults, because now Blanche was the ideal age for childish mischief. You need to get closer to Blanche, so close that she can say no if she doesn't like something. She'll probably look cute, just like an angry bunny. Abigail thought it was a bit early for a dress, but then a thought struck her. Abigail didn't know that Civilian was watching her through the window. He thought she was doing it again. He's keeping a close eye on this kid. Why she was conducting this surveillance and what conspiracy she was preparing this time was unclear to Civilian. She was so firm in her statement that Princess Blanche should not be treated like that. Civilian knew he had to take those words and the current surveillance of Blanche into account. And then there were those strange screams with a creepy facial expression and inappropriate behavior. Yes, these were all clear signs that she still hated Blanche. It looks like Blanche's walk has come to an end. But for some reason, Abigail continued to follow the princess. Civilian's eyes widened in surprise when she noticed the thing in her hands. Abigail carried a box with a monstrous expression on her face. Now the queen showed her true face, which made Civilian clench his fists. This door at the end of the long corridor was closed. Abigail looked at her from around the corner. All last week, she listened to a lot of stories about the princess and watched her. She also prepared a gift. Now all that was left was a small matter. The right moment was needed. Abigail was going to wait here and then pretend it was a coincidence, say they hadn't seen each other for a long time. But then she thought that this method wouldn't work, because she wasn't some kind of bully at school. Abigail was starting to get nervous, not knowing what to do or what to say. She decided to think about it from a different angle. Imagine that she came back from a walk, and her boss is standing outside her house, with whom she still feels uncomfortable dealing and is scared, and he suddenly holds a gift in his hands. It was the same with Blanche. She was still something of a boss to her. And she didn't like the situation itself. It sent shivers down her spine. It would have been better to leave the gift at the door and leave. This is what she was about to do, but someone suddenly called out to her, asking what Her Majesty was doing there. It was Civilian, and Abigail addressed him aloud as His Majesty, but in her mind she expressed herself much more rudely. Abigail said that she had prepared a gift for Princess Blanche, and was now just about to leave it and go. Frowning, Civilian asked again about the gift. Yes, Abigail confirmed, it was indeed a gift. Civilian ordered it to be given here. Abigail's face contorted with emotion. Then she became sad, and with a sad sigh expressed her readiness to do everything as he said. Civilian untied the ribbon on the gift box. The box contained a toy bunny in a smart dress. As you can see, it's a doll, Abigail said, explaining. She hoped that he already felt guilty for his suspicions. Moreover, this rabbit was in a pair with Blanche, and Civilian was behaving stupidly. Abigail was, of course, annoyed that the man had seen the gift before the girl herself, but she was going to think of Blanche hugging the bunny when she rewrote the gift, so she would forgive him for the mistake. But suddenly Civilian threw the toy on the ground. With the next movement, the man drew his sword. Abigail watched him with a puzzled look. The blade cut through the toy hair along with the beautiful dress. Abigail simply didn't have the words to say anything at that moment. Civilian bent over the toy and ripped it open, as if he were trying to find something inside. He was very enthusiastically rummaging through the soft filling, tearing the toy into pieces. "Just now," Abigail muttered. Civilian shook the toy one last time and threw it away. "True, it's an ordinary doll," he said, adding that he expected something different and suspected that there would be a needle or something like that inside. Abigail screamed with rage. She wanted to understand what His Majesty had just done. "It's amazing," Civilian said thoughtfully. "Ah, so that's how it is," Abigail thought. Civilian was simply a rude boor who aroused her justified anger. He clearly didn't feel a drop of guilt towards her. She resigned herself to the fact that for now, nothing could be done about his suspicion of her. However, was it really necessary to let it come to this? Abigail prepared all this for Blanc. She just wanted to make this girl happy. These pathetic remains of the doll reminded Abigail of herself, constantly putting together her broken and cut into pieces heart. She did it slowly, carefully, as if it made him even more precious. "Queen, father," a clear child's voice sounded very close. "Princess," Abigail said, turning around. She hesitated slightly, trying to do something. Abigail asked if Blanche was okay. Blanche assured her that everything was fine, but then she noticed something strange and asked what it was. "Ah," Abigail said, confused. She looked with hatred at Civilian, who was to blame for everything. There were many things she wanted to tell him now, but she forced herself to pull herself together. Even though she and Civilian were only connected by a marriage of convenience, parents still shouldn't quarrel in front of their child. Abigail said out loud that this was the doll she wanted to give to Blanche, but apparently the toy was poorly sewn. The seam came apart, and all the cotton wool fell out. Civilian's expression was completely stunned, but Blanche looked even stranger with her huge eyes. She hastened to inform Her Majesty that one of her maids sewed well. This willingness to help touched Abigail deeply. Blanche took the torn doll and said that everything was fine, the maid could mend it very well. Blanche hugged the hair and thanked Her Majesty, assuring her that she would treasure the gift very much. Abigail clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from asking out loud how this walking trash bag had produced such an angel. It must be that his late wife was a bodhisattva. Abigail apologized to the girl for making such a noise right in front of her room. Now she was going to take her leave so that Blanche could rest. "Okay," the girl answered. Abigail turned around to run away from this scene as quickly as possible. Civilian looked after her, not understanding anything. The Queen ran past him, covering her face with her palms. Abigail had no idea what to do. She was such a disgrace. It was too pathetic to act in front of this child. Lee Beckhap couldn't help but admit it. She hid behind a narrow column to bring her confused feelings into order. Abigail exhaled and said that everything was fine. She thought that a lot of good things had happened too. After all, Blanche accepted the gift and even thanked Abigail. She treated it very warmly. And there was also something else she could think about. Civilian was looking at the scrap of cloth in his hand at the time and was asked what he was thinking about. "Nothing," replied Civilian, squeezing the scrap of paper in his hand. He asked his assistant what the latest rumors about the Queen were. The assistant replied that, first of all, everyone says that she no longer abuses the servants. On the contrary, she now treats them well. They also say that she often brings gifts to Princess Blanche. These words made Civilian shudder. So this woman gave Blanche gifts. It was the first time Civilian had seen this woman like this. He asked his assistant what he thought, whether he really believed that the Queen had reformed. The aide replied that, given Her Majesty's character, it was to be assumed that this was all a game in which she was simply trying to put pressure on the family to gain favor. Civilian thought so too, until their last meeting. Could it really be that this was also just a clever game? A man entered to inform His Majesty that his ministers requested an audience. Civilian replied that he would allow them to enter. The men who appeared in the room asked if His Majesty was in good health and expressed the hope that they were not distracting him from his work. Civilian ordered to get down to business. One of the ministers asked His Majesty for forgiveness. He came to discuss the king's remarriage. The king and the minister's gazes met. The minister recalled that more than a year had passed since His Majesty's wedding, but the Queen still had not become pregnant, and what's more, they now live in separate rooms. If something like this happens, it is worth assuming that something is wrong with the Queen. In that case, the minister thought it right to offer His Majesty a meeting with his daughter, but Civilian did not listen to the end of what Duke Stock had to say. He interrupted him. As he said earlier, he is not going to marry again. The Duke continued to look at him with an uncomprehending gaze. He said that although his eldest daughter, Queen Miriam, died in childbirth, his youngest Karen is much younger and more beautiful. He was sure that His Majesty would change his mind as soon as he met her. Civilian interrupted his speech in a rather cold tone, causing him to shudder, and said that he would not repeat it twice. The Duke immediately backtracked, saying that as he got older he had more and more worries, so he spoke without thinking, but he hoped that His Majesty would forgive him. He was sincerely worried, and then asked the king not to be angry with him. If His Majesty lets him go, then he will go. Duke Stock left, clenching his fists tightly. Civilian watched him go. Then he asked those remaining in the room if they wanted to say anything too. Both his assistants remained silent. Then one of them said that he fully understood His Majesty's discomfort at the fact that the Duke was again trying to force his daughter on him. However, there was justice in his words. The birth of a successor was one of the royal duties, and if His Majesty did not like the Stock family, then he could think of a girl from another family. Civilian replied that if they continued this conversation, he would do something. He was asked if he wanted to say that there was nothing wrong with not having a direct heir. The assistant asked what His Majesty would do if Lord Raven married and had a son. He may have been an illegitimate child, but Lord Raven also had the noble blood of the late king in his veins, and he was raised as Civilian's brother, as his shadow. He knows very well that the aristocracy values blood above all else. The king's assistant asked His Majesty what the aristocracy thought between the princess's future husband and the son of Lord Raven, who had royal blood in his veins, who the aristocracy would prefer to see as the successor to the throne. Civilian noticed that his subject dared to lecture him as if he himself did not know all this. Yes, all this was quite possible, but still, today and tomorrow, Abigail will remain the king's only wife. Civilian didn't want to hear anything about another marriage, and everyone else could only accept it. He said that he was tired and wanted to rest, and Milad was also ordered to leave. He threw the assistants out and slammed the doors in their faces. One of them asked the other gloomily if the rumors were true. Was it really possible that they were true and that His Majesty preferred men? No, Milad hastened to answer, while Civilian sat alone in his office. He thought about how everyone kept insisting that he do his duty. Of course, he understood what they all wanted from him. After all, it was just another duty of the king. He had to, because everyone was waiting, because he had to become a good king. Civilian jumped up, knocking over the chair behind him with a crash. His face was distorted by unbearable emotions, and at his feet lay a tiny scrap of a doll's dress. Abigail said she would no longer demand that Civilian play the role of husband, but she wanted him to take a more responsible approach to his role as father. For some reason, these very words of hers came to mind now. He froze, picking up the scrap and squeezing it in his hands. Again, for the first time, he heard that he was not obliged to play the role of a husband. As for the role of the father, Blanche's sad little face immediately appeared before my eyes. Civilian didn't do a particularly good job of playing the father either. His pulse pounded in his temples, and Civilian thought that he would hardly be able to return to work today. He decided to just take a rest. He didn't understand why everything was like this. The mood was somehow too bad. The maids wished His Majesty a good rest and left, but they behaved somehow strangely. But as soon as Civilian chalked it all up to a bad day and opened his own bedroom door, he smelled roses. He entered the room and raised his head. An unexpected picture appeared before him. "Welcome," said the woman sitting on the bed among the scattered flower petals. "Your Majesty," said the woman, looking at him, and it was the strangest picture that Civilian could ever see in his life. "Your Majesty?" her voice sounded again. Civilian's face darkened as he looked at her. He asked if they hadn't decided to live separately. Abigail thought she knew he hated her, but his hatred was even stronger than she thought, and everything was even more complicated. Well, okay, she had prepared everything to embrace the despair of the man who hated Abigail to death. This romantic setting would become his personal hell on earth. And this seductive look for him was more akin to a demon coming to devour him. Everything was according to plan. There was no turning back. Civilian must have suffered like her rabbit had, who hadn't had time to really enjoy life, so Abigail asked if he was going to continue standing like that. "Queen," Civilian said, clenching his fists. No. She hadn't changed at all, and yet for a moment he believed in the sincerity of her desire to live separately. He was such a fool. Abigail said that this was true. She only wanted to slightly reduce his suspicion of her, which is why she initiated the separation. But it did not help. Civilian did not develop even a drop of trust in her. What else could she do, if only to stay close, to be constantly with Civilian, to prove her innocence? However, there was another option, which Abigail announced as she rose to her feet. If Civilian apologized for his suspicions, she would go to a separate room, as they had agreed. Civilian asked what would happen if he didn't apologize. Abigail said that then they would move in together and she would take off this robe. Then she added that under her robe she was now wearing extremely erotic underwear, which she could show off. Abigail thought that Civilian was wrong to be so scared she herself would never have undressed. It was Clara who was terribly indignant when she learned that Her Majesty was going to spend the night with her husband in the same bedroom and was wearing an ordinary nightgown. With tears in her eyes, the maid handed her a completely different set of underwear so that she would definitely wear it. Abigail said that they were just ropes and asked where Clara got them from, and yet she wore it under her robe. Abigail didn't understand why Civilian was hesitating again, because he didn't want her to undress either, but he still couldn't stop dragging his feet and just apologize. "Apparently I was wrong," Civilian finally said. He said he thought she would demand to share a home, using today's incident as an excuse. Abigail thought he was starstruck, but he was a king, and maybe that was how it was supposed to be for them. She threw up her hands and said that she did not understand why she would do such a thing, as she said she no longer needed Civilian's love. But, she said, looking intently into the eyes of her interlocutor, she still hasn't seen any attempts to apologize. Then she said that she would come every day from now on until Civilian apologized, and at that very moment he said. Hearing him apologize, Abigail thought that such a quick change of position looked very suspicious. Well, she herself knew how much Civilian hated her. But was she really just some kind of parasite for him? It infuriated her so much that she could barely contain herself. She stated that Civilian's words of apology sounded as if he spat them out of pure hopelessness, but that an apology should come from the heart, sincerely. Civilian's expression was very impressive. Abigail looked at him very angrily and determinedly. Finally, Civilian cleared his throat. He bowed and said that he apologized for his suspicions, for trying to find out the truth in a crude way, and for the fact that, in principle, he brought everything to the point that the Queen was waiting for his apology. Civilian said that he was sincerely sorry. Abigail thought he seemed to understand everything a little too well, and she wondered out loud why he had bowed at exactly 90 degrees. Was it really the first time he sincerely apologized? It was worth repenting, and he immediately became so gloomy. After a slight hesitation, Abigail said that she herself had done a lot of bad things in the past, which was why the misunderstandings had arisen, so it was worth forgetting about it. She leaned over the candelabra and blew out the candles. Abigail flung away the flower petals with a wave of her wide-sleeved arms. She said she would call someone to clean up the place. Abigail bowed, asked for her forgiveness, and wished His Majesty a good night's rest. But she suddenly lingered and didn't leave. "Listen, one more thing," she said. Abigail said that she had already said this several times, but she really did not intend to seek Civilian's love. She did not need either power or the conception of an heir. She just wanted to live quietly, without attracting attention to herself. So if Civilian believes, then he can bring another wife. Deep down she asked him to do this. Abigail remembered that before the wedding, Lady Karen of the Stock family had been a strong candidate alongside her. Civilian growled that he would not marry a woman from the Stock family. Abigail assured that she didn't care. He could choose someone from another house, marry someone. These words made Civilian frown. He grumbled that there was no difference between her and his ministers. He shouted that he was not going to marry anyone, and that from now on, Abigail would remain his only wife. He looked at her with an indignant look, and Abigail did not understand anything. Why he said such things if he hated her was unknown to her, but she couldn't relax. But out loud she said that she understood everything. She received an apology, so she was returning to her place. It was late at night, and that was when they had to leave, and Abigail didn't expect what would happen next. On the way back to her room, despite the fact that her head, full of worries, had cooled under the cold spring wind, her heart continued to beat wildly in her chest, as if it was about to explode, perhaps due to the scent of roses that had not yet faded from her skin and clothes. There were many cosmetic bottles on the shelf. While combing the Queen's hair, Clara used some of them. Other maids were also involved in caring for Her Majesty's appearance. Abigail was in bliss. It seemed that this was the taste of power. She herself did not understand where her inner girl, modest to the bone, had gone. Gradually, she began to get used to this luxurious life. Money really was better than anything in the world, and it seemed amazing. Clara said she would apply scented oil to Her Majesty's hair. The scent made Abigail open her eyes. He recalled how Civilian had shouted that she was his only wife. Abigail became extremely agitated and thought she was going crazy. She turned to Clara, who was also worried. She asked the maid to use some other oil next time. No more roses. Clara asked her to forgive her. She wasn't sure if she could talk about it. Clara asked cautiously if something had happened in His Majesty's bedroom that day. "Oh," what Abigail said, turning around. After all, the queen returned so quickly, Clara assumed that it was because she had picked bad, fragrant herbs. She had decorated everything with roses, but perhaps Her Majesty did not like the smell of roses. Abigail replied that it wasn't that, because she knew Clara had really put a lot of effort into decorating the room. Clara asked in shock if that underwear was really not to His Majesty's taste, since he might have preferred innocence over sexuality. Clara burst into tears, because she had not been careful. She simply did not think that there was a man who would not like this. Abigail assured with a laugh that it was nothing. It was not worth worrying about. Everything went well. Thank God, Clara rejoiced. Next time she will prepare everything even better. She made inquiries about a very famous lingerie designer, so Her Majesty just needs to trust her. Abigail thought that at this rate she and Clara would walk side by side to the gallows. The door creaked and a gift was brought in for Her Royal Majesty. Abigail asked curiously who the gift might be from. The lady who came said that this box was from His Majesty. Abigail was puzzled by what was happening, but Clara beamed and declared that it was the power of lingerie. Abigail replied that no, absolutely not. She thought that Clara needed to calm down. She was clearly addicted. Abigail began to unpack the gift. She had no idea what could be in there. This person could not have sent something like a cursed doll. Finally, the lid was removed from the box. She turned to the maid who had arrived with the gift and asked if His Majesty had sent it. Clara exclaimed that she also wanted to know what was in the box. She was interested and asked to let her see. "Oh, this!" she exclaimed, looking at the gift. They were 2 toy rabbits, mother and daughter, in luxurious dresses. Instead of eyes, the toys had brightly sparkling gems. Clara noticed that the rabbit looked like Her Majesty, and Abigail thought that the outfit was exactly the same as the one she was wearing that day. Clara assumed that this little rabbit was Princess Blanche, which meant that Civilian wasn't such a bad person after all. The maid even wondered if there was a king rabbit in this charming gift. Abigail didn't think the rabbit would be a good fit for Civilian. She suddenly noticed that there was also a note tucked under the toys. It was a sealed envelope, and she took it out of the box. Civilian sent Abigail a letter. He wrote that he had been given information about the princess's dresses, and that if another instance of ignoring the agreed budget for the royal palace was discovered, it would henceforth be deducted from the budget allocated to the queen's share. Civilian asked for restraint. Abigail crumpled the letter in her hands. She took everything she said back. Civilian was a freak and a real scoundrel. Abigail was shaking with rage. Some time passed. The sun stood high above the mansion. Abigail's high heels clicked loudly on the tiles. The guest bent down to kiss her hand and thanked Her Majesty for taking the time to meet him. Abigail said she heard he had a good item. She hoped it was reliable. The guest assured that, of course, he was surprised that Her Majesty had doubts. He confidently declared that even a princess would not be able to resist these. "Yes, okay," Abigail said. She examined the contents of the jar with increased interest. She thought about Blanche and, without noticing, laughed ominously. Her visitor's eye even twitched at the sight of this picture. Abigail said that as far as she knew, these were foreign and expensive goods that were not imported into this country, so the person who delivered them was a professional. He explained that he had secretly purchased several jars when he visited Kronberg. Abigail leaned over the jar, inhaling the particularly sweet aroma. She said that she would generously reward the merchant, who immediately expressed his gratitude with a bow. He noticed that he had other things that might be to Her Majesty's liking, and offered to look at them. "Okay," Abigail replied. The merchant's men began to carry boxes. Abigail and her ladies watched as the new merchandise was unpacked. Abigail said that usually the merchants would drag all sorts of junk here in a line, but these things were quite worthy of attention. Abigail said that she especially liked the goods of this particular person. He would now be on her special account. Yes, everything was just like with that mirror that could give an answer to who in the world is the fairest of all. The real Abigail had absolutely no taste. About a month ago, she was shown a pearl necklace. The merchant said that since this was an expensive, high-quality product that even a sea princess could not afford, the merchant would make an exception only for Her Majesty and sell it for only 20,000 dirhams. He asked what Her Majesty would say. Abigail asked if there was anything else. The merchant realized that the queen showed no interest in jewelry. Abigail, born a noble princess, was not fully aware of the world and was overly proud. She always looked unperturbed when she pretended that she actually knew everything in the world. Apparently, in the past, she often overpaid merchants because of this. Then she was asked what she thought of this vase, which had come from the Far East, a family heirloom of an Eastern royal family that was very difficult to obtain. Further, Abigail said, it was immediately obvious that it was cheap. The merchant didn't know if she could tell it was a fake. But no, This queen could not. He said that this was to be expected from Her Majesty. Apparently such things could not catch her keen eye. In that case, the merchant could only show her an expensive magical artifact created in the Elven Kingdom. The merchant said that this was a very expensive item. He saw the interest in the queen's eyes and thought that he had finally caught her. Now he could leave here, having received a huge pile of money at once. The merchant ordered Hessen, his assistant, to bring the thing, and he shuddered and asked again if they were really talking about that very thing. Then he said, "Okay, I understand." He soon returned with a huge and obviously heavy box. Hessen dropped the box onto the table with a heavy thud. "Look," said the merchant, opening the lock. Everyone present looked inside the chest with curiosity. "Isn't it wonderful?" asked the merchant. But Abigail suddenly frowned. The merchant made a gesture with his hands, as if he were holding something in the air, and announced that it was a dress woven from morning dew, dawn rays, and cobwebs. The merchant said that since this dress is imbued with magic, it is invisible to the eyes of evil and foolish people, but Her Majesty must be able to appreciate the beauty of this dress. The ladies heard that the dress was so light that no one could even feel its weight. It was cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and it was also beautiful. Such a precious thing could not be found in a lifetime. The merchant asked his assistant if he thought the dress was not magnificent, and Hessen replied that it was a very beautiful dress. Then he asked the girls what they would say. Wouldn't it look beautiful on the queen? The ladies, embarrassed, replied that it would suit her very well because the design was so sophisticated. The merchant smiled and said that this dress would suit Her Majesty perfectly, and therefore he would sell it to her for half the price, only 300,000 darons. "This dress?" Abigail asked skeptically. The merchant asked hintingly whether Her Majesty could not see him. He thought she was too proud to say no in front of everyone now. "No, it couldn't be," said Abigail, but as the merchant had claimed, she thought the thing was truly beautiful. The merchant realized that the fish had swallowed his bait. He could already smell the money, literally feel it in his hands. But Abigail suddenly said that it was strange, but she clearly saw a man's formal suit. Abigail asked if the suit would not be more suitable for the merchant himself than for her, a woman, so she offered to try it on for him first, and if it fit well, she would recommend it to the king. The merchant quickly slammed the chest shut and said that it looked like he had simply brought the wrong thing by accident. Next time he would be able to offer something more suitable. "I said to put it on," the queen said firmly. Abigail said it was an order, and the merchant was completely wrong to take her command for an offer. She ordered that the merchant be taken to an empty room, and that after he had changed, he be returned here immediately. As the guards dragged the merchant away, he resisted and screamed, addressing Her Majesty. Soon he was indeed returned, and he looked absolutely unsightly. "Oh," Abigail exclaimed. "The suit looked great on him," she said, and now that he was dressed up, all he had to do was go to the most appropriate place for such an outfit. The queen's expression suddenly changed, and she growled that even looking at him was sickening, and ordered that he be thrown into prison immediately. The merchant begged Her Majesty to have mercy on him. Abigail thought that her predecessor had been too easy to fool. Now even the rabble was making fun of her. She announced for the next trader to enter. From that day on, the Merchants' Union found itself in a precarious position due to the replacement of the extremely naive Abigail with another person. She became furious that merchants had come to the palace to offer such junk, but it was impossible to find anything new or interesting among their goods. Abigail said she needed something more. She wanted something cuter or more unusual, something that might appeal to a little 11-year-old girl, but they didn't have anything like that, and Abigail had never looked for anything for anyone else before that moment. Meanwhile, one of the merchants said that, frankly speaking, he had one real magical artifact. Abigail didn't believe it. She thought they would offer her another invisible dress. The merchant assured that under no circumstances would this happen, and ordered the goods to be brought from the carriage. "Here, Your Majesty," said the merchant, when the goods, covered with a cloth, were brought in. It was a magic mirror created by fairies, also called the Mirror of Truth. "Mirror of Truth," Abigail said. With a rustling sound, the fabric slid off the mirror in its luxurious frame. Its surface sparkled, and Abigail looked at her reflection. She came closer and touched the smooth surface. "My mirror, tell me, who in the world is the fairest, the rosiest, and the whitest?" she said. The reflection in the mirror trembled, attracting attention. Her eyes widened with delight. "Well, it's definitely not you who's asking such stupid questions," came clearly from the mirror. Everyone present was completely stunned by what was happening. The merchant fell to his knees and began to beat his forehead on the floor, exclaiming that he was guilty before Her Majesty, that he was sincerely sorry. Apparently the servant had brought defective goods, which he took out to return, and now he was asking for mercy. The mirror heard and asked who was called defective here. The mirror declared that everyone apparently thought it was the same as those things that were created to pass through the hands of all sorts of madams. It screamed and called names at those who tried to take it away from here. But the merchant ordered that it be taken away quickly, first locked in the carriage, and that other goods be brought immediately. The servants covered the mirror with a cloth and tried to carry out the order. But the queen's voice declared that this was not necessary. Abigail moved closer. She tore the cloth from the magic mirror again. With the cloth in her hands, Abigail looked at the mirror and around her with a very gloomy expression. She turned to the mirror and asked why it had just called her stupid, why she was stupid. The mirror replied that she was asking absurd questions. The mirror assumed that asking who in the world was the fairest, the rosiest, and the whitest was stupid, because no one could answer such a subjective and abstract question. After all, there are as many opinions regarding beauty as there are people in the world. For some, Abigail may be the most beautiful. But for some, it will be the girl standing behind the queen. Norma, who the mirror spoke about, blushed and became scared. She said that she was not like that. The mirror said that this was why the question was stupid, and Clara asked Mrs. Norma what she would say to all this. The merchant began to beat his forehead against the floor again, begging Her Majesty to allow him to bring her another mirror. Abigail chuckled, saying she would tear it off with her hands. The merchant felt as if she was threatening to tear his hands off. But Abigail only stated that she was buying the mirror because she liked it. Everyone around was simply in unimaginable shock. When the mirror was placed in the royal chambers, Abigail decided to get to know it better. She asked what she should call it, if it had a name. She thought it was so heartless to call it just a mirror. It was a very stupid name, but the mirror insisted that it had to be called that. The mirror said that no one gives names to objects, and Abigail agreed with this statement. But then she can give the mirror a name right now. She would like to call it Verite. The mirror thought for a moment, and then replied that Abigail did not at all seem like the woman he had heard about. Abigail asked curiously. But the mirror said that the name was not bad, because Verite means truth. Abigail replied that that was good, and then asked if Verite could do anything other than gossip. The mirror replied that it was smarter than any high-ranking official in this palace, and Abigail liked that too. Since it was destined that the mirror's life would be very short, the mirror decided, then let it shatter into pieces and disappear, for it was better to die than to be soiled by the flattery of this queen with a lousy reputation. Abigail looked at her reflection. She was still embarrassed to see this face, even though it was beautiful, but the mirror did not understand whether it was really that same Abigail. Now it was her face, and at that moment it spoke to her from the mirror. It was such a strange feeling. Suddenly she recoiled from the mirror with a scream. Because instead of her own reflection, a young guy was now looking back at her. "Is that better?" he asked Abigail. She looked closely at this new version, and then she thanked me with a smile for the handsome man. Yes, it became much better. Abigail informed the mirror that from today on, Verite would be assisting her in the palace, and there were 3 conditions that must be met in order for them to work together. The mirror immediately asked what kind. Abigail ordered to stop talking to her so informally. "Well, whatever you say, so say it," responded Verite. Secondly, Abigail would like him to always tell the truth, as befits a name like his, specifically, not to lie or toady. It was strange that she asked not to fawn over the mirror, which was created precisely for this purpose. Abigail noticed that Verite hadn't done that before. He laughed and said that he would do as Her Majesty commanded. The last condition, according to Abigail, was the most important. You had to listen carefully. The sweetest, the rosiest, and the whitest in the world was Princess Blanche, and you had to realize and remember this. Abigail ordered that this was always the answer to such a question when she asked it. Verite exclaimed that she shouldn't make him laugh. He had just said that he couldn't answer an abstract question. Plus, Abigail herself had just ordered him to tell her only the truth. Abigail told him to stop, because this was the real truth, so he could safely answer that it was Princess Blanche. Verite asked what he would become if he retreated after the recent uproar on this topic. He apologized unconvincingly and stated that he was a principled mirror, and he would not back down from his words. It cannot be assumed that if he does not have a body, then he has no pride. He thought that to die, so to die with a song, to submit to authority and to renounce his own words was unacceptable. "Oh God, that's how it is," Abigail said, pressing her face against the mirror surface. It crunched, and Verite closed his eyes in fear. With a ringing sound, the mirror shattered into pieces and they scattered in all directions. That day, Verite met this strange queen for the first time and found himself forced to listen helplessly to her eerie voice, which asked who in the world was the fairest of all. And Verite was forced to answer that it was Princess Blanche. Abigail asked who in the world had the rosiest complexion, and again the correct answer was that it was Princess Blanche. "Who is the whitest of them all?" said Abigail. "Blanche, Blanche, Princess Blanche," Verite repeated in an irritated voice. He asked how much longer he would have to say it. He asked Abigail to stop, because it could not be repeated so many times. The sound of the shards was the sound of his pride shattering into tiny pieces. Abigail winced and asked how he could be so loud when he didn't even have a real mouth. Plus, she had told him to only speak to her respectfully. Turning his back to her, Verite said that he didn't care about anything anymore. He didn't know anything anymore. It was better to flatter noble ladies. She had made him repeat the same thing countless times, 11 times already today. Abigail laughed, not realizing she had asked that question so many times. Verite angrily said that she was overdoing it, and asked if she was getting tired of talking about Blanche all day long. Abigail stated that it was his duty to listen to all of this because he was an unemployed mirror, and he had a prepared answer, so he needed to repeat it. What could be wrong with that? With a sigh, Verite said that it was unbearably hard for him to live. Abigail said okay, that was it. They would move on to the next topic. Now they will choose a gift for Blanche: shoes, a handbag, jewelry, a dress. She had about 20 blanks. She told Verite to make her face simpler because it would be fun. Verite started whining that he didn't want to, that he wouldn't have any choice anymore. Abigail had already said that she had gotten some violet sweets or something like that. She could just give them to Blanche, but she was acting like a merciless mistress. Abigail thought he was continuing to be rude to her. She just really wanted to just take and hit him. She thought that Verite was like some kind of younger brother or friend to her here, but she was ready to turn a blind eye to it. The guy's reflection tried to go somewhere into the depths of the mirror depths. Abigail thought that he was really offended. He was saying it with his whole appearance. "Believe me," she said. She reminded him that she was a queen, and there was nowhere else in the palace where she could discuss all this. He knew that he was the only one here whom she trusted completely. Abigail asked him to talk to her about Blanche, and in exchange she would listen to his reasoning on the principles of magic. Verite glanced at her over his shoulder. Well, nothing could be done about it. Abigail thought with glee that she had gotten a magic nerd, but this was the standard strategy when you give to me, and I give to you. Since Verite agreed, Abigail could begin. First, he will help her choose a ribbon. "Okay, bring it here, Bibi," said Verite. Abigail realized that since he was calling her by her nickname, he didn't seem to be offended anymore. Verite looked at Abigail thoughtfully and said that the purple ribbon looked best. Abigail looked at the tapes and noted that her mirror interlocutor had good taste. She hoped that Blanche would like the gift she had prepared for her. Verite looked at her with surprise. He didn't really recognize her now. The queen looked happy at that moment, and the princess will definitely like the gift, who might not like these violet candies. Abigail said with a smile that she would trust the opinion of the smartest mirror in the palace. She said she would be back soon and hurried to meet Blanche. Abigail's heart beat strongly during the journey to the palace. Clara asked what Her Majesty was going to give Her Highness Blanche. These were violet candies that could only be found in Kronberg, Abigail's homeland. Clara gasped. She had heard about them. They were incredibly tasty, but they were very difficult to obtain, and they were absolutely not transported abroad. The maid even waved her hands in delight, exclaiming how lucky Her Highness was. Abigail asked her not to worry so much. Besides, she had 2 more of these jars. She would give one to Clara and the other maids. "True," Clara exclaimed with delight. The girl was sure that their queen was a real angel. She said Abigail was the best in the world. Abigail wasn't prepared to hear something like that about herself. "Just a second," she said, waving her hand. Suddenly, her gaze was caught by a scene in the corridors of the palace. "It looks like they have some guests." A fair-haired man and woman stood at the end of the corridor and looked at each other. "Oh God, who is this?" asked the spontaneous Clara. "The Duke of Stock," replied Madame Norma, explaining that he had apparently come to visit his younger sister, Madame Jeremy. Abigail didn't understand what they were doing outside Princess Blanche's room, even if that was the case. Abigail thought darkly that she wished she knew what they were talking about so happily. Was it possible that Abigail's death was on the conscience of these two? The thought flashed through her mind. So she stopped and watched as the brother and sister who were talking bowed and went their separate ways. Madame Jeremy retired to the princess's chambers, the door slamming loudly behind her. Abigail continued to watch, and a curious Clara peered over her shoulder. Abigail sighed loudly. She frowned sternly, her resolve filling her mind. "It's okay. Everything will be fine. Whoever the conspirators are, she won't let them carry out their plans." "Okay, let's go," Abigail said, turning to her companions. The high heels of her shoes clicked loudly on the floor tiles with every step. A girl in a yellow dress bowed before Abigail and greeted her. She explained that Princess Blanche was currently having an etiquette lesson and then asked them to pass. Abigail asked if she could come in, and the girl said, "Of course." She asked Norma and Clara to wait for her here for a while. Blanche carried a book on her head, which was visibly shaking. Her legs in her elegant high-heeled shoes were also shaking, and the girl almost stumbled. Under the watchful eye of Madame Jeremy, Princess Blanche continued on her way with a book on her head. She was focused on what she was doing. It was clearly not easy for her. Abigail sighed, covering her mouth with her hand. She thought this painting was supposed to look elegant, but serious Blanche with a book on her head looked simply very cute. Abigail was saddened by the fact that in this era cameras had not yet been invented. Now she would like to burn this picture into the retina of her eyes. Blanche was always the best. Abigail looked at her for so long without taking her eyes off that her eyes even began to water. At that moment, Blanche staggered again and the book began to slide off her head. She fell to the floor with a crash next to the girl. Blanche shuddered in fear, her eyes wide as she looked at this catastrophe. Madame Jeremy frowned sternly. She bent down to pick up the book and told the girl that she was a princess, the daughter of the late Queen Miriam. Therefore, she had to have the same perfect manners as her mother. With a thud, Madame Jeremy dropped the book back on Blanche's head. Once again, the governess commanded, and Blanche readily responded that it was good. With all diligence, the girl again continued to perform this difficult exercise. "Ah," sighed Blanche, dropping the ill-fated book again. "Oh!" she exclaimed when she lost her way again. The book fell more and more often. Blanche looked completely upset. Madame Jeremy exhaled with an air of infinite weariness. She told the frightened girl that she needed to pay more attention to her posture. Madame Jeremy said that beauty comes from the ability to carry oneself, no matter how luxurious a dress a princess wears. As soon as she stumbles, her radiance will immediately fade. Abigail thought the governess was being too harsh, since Blanche was only a child. Madame Jeremy said that the most important thing for a woman is her beauty. Madame Jeremy believed that no matter how influential or gifted a woman was, her opinion would not be taken into account unless she was attractive enough. Abigail shuddered at hearing such speech. She couldn't believe her own ears. How could she tell such things to a child? It was completely wrong. Even if it was a fantasy world, Abigail hated these damn outdated customs. She knew what it was like when achievements weren't valued, and a girl just needed to be cute to have a good life, so she had to think about losing a few extra pounds. Men said about her that she could only be a friend, that it was completely stupid to take her for the passion of one of them, because such ugly women are not even considered girls. They told her that she was a girl, but she didn't take care of herself at all, and a man didn't have to do that, because a man should take it with skills. In that past life, she was constantly pressured to finally lose weight, and as soon as she had more free time, she would have to get some plastic surgery. Even those who called themselves her friends told her this, explaining that they cared about her. She was hardworking and always got the highest grades, but if she failed interviews because of her face, it was always a terrible disappointment. She knew that people judged you by your clothes. Yes, it was unfair, but what could be done about it? That was their society. That was how it worked. Meanwhile, Madame Jeremy was giving instructions to Princess Blanche. She said that she needed to keep her back straighter and direct her gaze a little lower. Then the governess noticed Blanche's waist. She asked if the princess had recently eaten anything that was not on the special menu prepared for her. "No," Blanche replied, blushing furiously, but Madame Jeremy noticed that the girl's waist had definitely become wider. It was clear to her that she would now have to monitor the princess's diet more carefully. Abigail thought angrily that she didn't understand how exactly Madame Jeremy was going to keep Blanche on a diet. Was it really appropriate to do that to an 11-year-old growing body? Blanche was already much smaller and thinner than she should be at her age. At this point, the governess said that for now they could take a short break. She allowed the girl to rest for 10 minutes. Abigail finally decided to attract attention to herself and coughed expressively. "Ah, Your Majesty," exclaimed Princess Blanche. Madame Jeremy bowed and greeted Her Majesty, and then asked what brought her to the princess's chambers today. Abigail replied that she had brought something for Blanche. She handed the girl a jar tied with the chosen ribbon. The girl reached for it with curiosity, asking what it was. "Open up," Abigail said with a slight smile. Blanche opened the lid with joy. Blanche's eyes sparkled with delight. "What a sweet scent," the girl exclaimed. Abigail explained to her that these were violet candies, which were extremely popular in her homeland, and they were very tasty, so she wanted Blanche to definitely try them. The girl's hand reached for the candy. "Thank you," said Blanche, and happily took one of the candies. "Princess," came the governess's voice, causing the girl to shudder. Madame Jeremy asked with a hypocritical smile, but the princess wasn't actually going to eat it. Then she turned to Abigail and said that the princess needed to limit her food intake. She apologized, but she was forced to ask Her Majesty to take back her gift. Abigail replied that she was categorically against putting a growing child on a diet. Madame Jeremy explained that all this was being done for the good of the princess herself. The governess replied that Her Majesty had firmly and clearly stated that she was entrusting the princess's upbringing entirely to her. These words made Abigail extremely angry. Yes, she once entrusted all the training to Madame Jeremy, so that she would simply not bother her once again. She hoped that she would no longer come to her because of all sorts of nonsense. Abigail didn't understand. The past version of Abigail did this all the time. Blanche tugged at Abigail's skirt to get her attention. "Your Majesty," the girl pleaded, and assured that she didn't really need the candy. She apologized for acting insatiably. "Blanche," Abigail said, turning to the girl. "Your Majesty, everything is fine. I don't really need candy," Blanche assured her. Abigail thought with horror at how an 11-year-old child could be brought to such an expression. She put her hand on Blanche's shoulder. "Princess," Abigail said, looking into her eyes, "if you want to eat them, eat them." Blanche looked at her attentively and remained silent. "Your Majesty," Madame Jeremy's voice rang out, and Blanche shuddered and lowered her head. The governess said that she perfectly understood Her Majesty's desire to please the princess with sweets. But the princess couldn't gain weight so that her beautiful, perfect figure would be visible in the dress. "The dress!" Abigail repeated angrily, glaring at Madame Jeremy. In a rage, she asked if the dress was really more important than the princess's health and height. She saw Madame Jeremy flinch when she heard her words. The governess exclaimed that she simply did not understand that as soon as the age for wearing corsets for adults arrived, other noblewomen also watched their figures. Abigail clenched her fists, thinking that the child had been tortured so much just because of the corset and the clothes. The queen and the governess's gazes met. "Well, I get it," Abigail said. She said that in that case, she would relieve Madame Jeremy of the responsibility of raising the princess. She would hire someone else who would look after her nutrition and health. "Your Majesty," cried Madame Jeremy, but Abigail adamantly repeated that she was dismissed. Abigail simply needed to talk to the princess. Said the now former governess. She turned quickly to leave the princess's chambers. Abigail thought sadly that in this alien and mysterious world, the same outdated views existed. In her past life, she also hardly ate and took appetite suppressants to lose weight, and she did this until her death. "I'm so sorry, Your Majesty," Blanche muttered fearfully, promising not to eat any more sweets and asking the queen not to be angry. Abigail turned to the girl, still with an angry look on her face. Blanche still made her feel tender, so she looked at her tenderly. She said that she was not angry at all, and Blanche could eat sweets. Abigail picked up the jar of violet candies again. She invited Blanche to enjoy some sweets together. Blanche replied in fear that if she gained weight, she would not be able to fit into her dresses. So what Abigail asked her? She stated that children have every right to eat lots of tasty things and grow up healthy and happy. No one should infringe on these rights, as if Blanche were an adult. Abigail told the princess to remember this well. There was nothing more important in the world than her happiness. Abigail handed the girl a new purple candy with a gentle smile. Blanche looked at this candy and trembled. The girl looked up at the queen hesitantly. Abigail smiled and handed her the sweets. The girl's eyes became delighted and she beamed. Blanche began to eat the sweets. She gasped at the sensations she experienced. Abigail asked if the princess had enjoyed her meal. Blanche nodded and asked if she could have some more. "Of course," Abigail replied and handed her more candy. With a satisfied smile, she admired the girl eating the treats. Suddenly something happened and Blanche's face changed. Abigail looked at her with alarm. Blanche burst into tears and covered her own mouth with her hands. Abigail jumped up and called out to the princess in alarm. She couldn't understand what had happened. Maybe a pebble had gotten into the treats, and then Blanche needed to spit it out as quickly as possible. But the girl replied through tears that nothing of the sort had happened. She simply admitted that it was the first time she had eaten something so sweet. These words horrified and touched Abigail. She hastened to gently wipe away Blanche's tears. She pressed the girl to her chest and thought that she had burst into tears just because of one candy. It was scary to think what this little girl had endured and for how long. From now on, whatever she wishes for, Abigail will give her all the sweets in the world. Blanche, burying her face in her shoulder, continued to cry. Abigail hugged her, hoping to find ways to comfort her. Blanche was so tiny for her age. Perhaps her growth was stunted by her constant strict diet. Tomorrow Abigail will bring her more sweets, and the day after tomorrow she will bring even more delicious sweets. She will bring her sweets from all over the world every day. So Blanche no longer had to cry. Now a radiant smile would always shine on her face. After some time, the table was set for dinner. Civilian and Abigail sat at it together and ate in complete silence. Abigail looked at him and thought that this was all too awkward. Civilian glanced at her across the table too often. Abigail thought she was going to get indigestion soon. She couldn't even taste what she was eating. If Civilian was going to eat in such silence, it was completely unclear why he invited her there. Finally, Civilian said that he had heard that Abigail had quarreled with the governess Blanche. Civilian's gaze was cold and dispassionate. Abigail put down her fork, which clinked pitifully. "Yes, it's true," Abigail replied. Civilian asked dryly about the reason for such an act. Abigail replied that she had not given the princess anything to eat properly. Civilian noted that Madame Jeremy had insisted that it was all for Blanche's good. Abigail said that the forced fasting was too harsh on the still young princess. Moreover, Madame has no respect for Blanche at all. Civilian asked if Abigail had any proof. Abigail replied that Madame had not even asked the princess's opinion when she chose dresses for her. These words explained to Civilian what had really happened with Blanche's dresses. But is that really the only reason why this lover of luxury spent so much money on clothes for Blanche? Civilian explained that Madame Jeremy claimed to make such decisions for Blanche because the girl was too young for them. Abigail's expression darkened and she frowned. She exclaimed that even dogs and cats have their own will, and this woman says that Blanche, a human being, does not know what she likes and what she does not. Civilian asked what Madame was going to do about it next, since they now had to find a new governess for Blanche. Abigail replied that she didn't care who it was, as long as that person respected the princess. Civilian thought that perhaps she had driven out Madame Jeremy, a close confidant of the previous queen, to strengthen her own position. She said that she didn't need power or the conception of an heir. She just wanted to live quietly without attracting attention to herself. Civilian asked if he was being unreasonably suspicious again. "What?" Abigail asked. Civilian replied that nothing, and then asked if she would mind if he brought someone from the stock household to act as a nanny. Abigail replied that she didn't care. She just wanted the man not to make her starve. Civilian leaned towards her. He noticed that his interlocutor seemed to be overly concerned with food. Abigail thought with indignation that he had just called her a glutton, saying that she was getting fat because of what she ate, while he was clearly deliberately provoking a conflict. But no, she forced herself not to make things up, because now she was objectively thin. He probably didn't mean anything like that. He wasn't that sick. Civilian, meanwhile, looked at her thoughtfully. He said that he understood everything. He would remove Madame Jeremy from her position. And he suddenly offered to let Abigail take the empty seat. Abigail didn't immediately realize what he had said. Civilian explained this by saying that Abigail, although not blood-related, was the princess's mother, and then asked if it could be that she simply didn't like the princess. "No, it can't be," Abigail screamed. Civilian said that everything was then decided and rose from the table. Once his business was finished, there was no need for him to stay here. He headed for the door, and Abigail remained sitting. She thought that was right. That was what she was for Blanche. A man approached Civilian in the corridor. He bowed to him with courtesy. Ignoring him, Civilian walked down the corridor. The man asked if everything was all right with His Majesty. He reminded that leaving the Queen near Princess Blanche could be dangerous. Civilian turned and looked at him. He said that he believed that she was not that stupid. The princess had already been assigned guards, so nothing bad would happen to her. The aide said the very idea that His Majesty had entrusted the princess to the Queen was unexpected. He wanted to know why His Majesty did this. Civilian replied that he wanted to make sure. "What?" his interlocutor asked. Civilian didn't understand if she had really changed or if it was just a game. He expected that she would soon show her true intentions. True, to those around him it sounded as if His Majesty had suddenly developed feelings for the Queen. Civilian was surprised by this assumption. This only elicited a dismissive snort from him. Royal marriages have always been mere transactions, and nothing like feelings were necessary in such unions. The interlocutor tried to object, but he did not finish the sentence, but lowered his head with a sigh. They continued on their way. Civilian walked forward at a rapid pace, and his assistant soon began to lag behind him. He clenched his hands into fists. "Your Majesty," he thought, looking at Savilan's back. Abigail watched the clock tick away. She took a few sips of water from her glass in excitement. Then she put the glass down on the table with a sharp bang. There were 10 minutes left before the appointed time. Abigail couldn't even close her eyes at night. This was to be his and Blanche's first meal together. During the dinner with this unbearable king, Abigail almost felt sick from discomfort, but this time she was nervous for a completely different reason. Her heart was beating so hard. Abigail asked Clara how her face looked today, if she looked very scary. Clara looked at her with a smile and said that she saw Her Majesty's ordinary face. Laughing, Clara declared that Her Majesty's face looked terrible but beautiful because the Queen was the best. No, Abigail thought, and imagined that soft expression reflected in the sparkling surface of the spoon. It was too scary. As she thought, it was better for her not to even try to smile. Suddenly footsteps were heard. Someone came very close. Abigail raised her head and turned around in alarm at the sound. A cheerful and elegant Blanche appeared, greeted Her Majesty, and politely asked if she was too late. As always, the girl delighted Abigail because Blanche was simply charming and extremely sweet today. Abigail told the girl that she was not late at all and invited her to sit down at the table. With her heart pounding, Abigail thought that today she would finally feed Blanche some goodies. She told the princess that she didn't know what exactly she liked, so she ordered something simple to start with. She hoped that the girl would like it. Blanche clenched her fists in delight. "Then let's get started," Abigail said almost solemnly. She scooped up some soup from her bowl with a spoon. Abigail herself thought it was quite tasty. Blanche should like it too. Abigail glanced at the girl to check. She asked in surprise if the princess was not going to eat, and Blanche gasped as if she had been taken by surprise by this question. The girl, anxious and focused, asked if she was sure she could eat all of it. "What?" Abigail asked, confused. The main course hadn't even arrived yet. Blanche explained that she was simply usually told to eat half a portion of salad. Abigail thought with hatred that Blanche was already given children's portions, but she was also forced to eat only half. She did not even hear Clara gasp behind her that something was wrong with Her Majesty's face. Abigail coughed hastily into her fist. She said that Blanche was free to eat as much as she wanted. She did not have to hold back or force herself to finish it. Blanche beamed and finally began to eat. She raised her hand to her mouth and took the first sip of soup. "Delicious," said the girl with a charming smile. Abigail watched Blanche eat her portion with gusto. She thought that she was fed up just by looking at this spectacle. This is probably how grandmothers feel during the holidays. Abigail couldn't understand how they could starve such a sweet child when she devoured everything. She looked like a hamster. Abigail thought it seemed that the man who called himself Blanche's father simply watched this torture silently and indifferently. She decided to ask Blanche about this, whether it was true that when she dined with His Majesty, he said nothing. But Blanche replied that they had never eaten together, and that was why he remained silent. Abigail was surprised that this had never happened. The girl explained that her father always had a lot of government business, so they always ate separately. Abigail wondered why Civilian was so cold to Blanche. She knew a little about him from rumors circulating among the people. Miriam, the previous queen, left the world shortly after Blanche gave birth, and Civilian kept the queen's place empty for 10 whole years. It was said that during this long time, he yearned for his late wife. Abigail heard that the reason Civilian disliked Blanche was because he blamed her for the death of his beloved queen. But Blanche wasn't to blame. Abigail knew that. Meanwhile, Blanche had finished eating and was looking thoughtfully ahead. Abigail asked her how she liked her lunch. "Yes, yes, very tasty," the girl exclaimed with joy. Abigail told the maid to bring dessert since they were almost finished with everything else. And then a variety of sweets were placed on the table in porcelain saucers. Blanche looked at them as if she had never seen them before. Abigail and Blanche began to dine on the treat. Abigail herself happily tried the delicacy. The delicate cake simply melted in your mouth. Blanche must have liked something so delicious, Abigail thought, and glanced furtively at the girl. Blanche's reaction was suddenly puzzling. The girl clearly tried the treat, but her reaction was not as expected. "Oh, Your Majesty!" Blanche exclaimed, pulling her plate toward Abigail, offering her portion as well. Abigail asked worriedly if the princess didn't like the eclair, then she would immediately order something else to be brought. Blanche replied that it wasn't that it tasted bad, so Abigail suggested that perhaps the portion was too big for the girl. But Blanche explained that it was not like that at all. It really was very tasty. But that was why she wanted to give the treat to Her Majesty. Abigail felt that at that very moment she could die absolutely happy. It turned out that she and Blanche had already become quite close. Abigail felt almost sick from the emotions she was experiencing. She thought how the child could be so sweet and kind. She just dreamed that Blanche would let her squeeze her cheeks. She managed to pull herself together and tell the princess that she was very grateful to her, but her concern was enough. She sincerely wanted Blanche to enjoy these eclairs because they were really delicious, and she could always ask for more, so there was no need to worry that there wouldn't be enough treats. Abigail pushed the cake back to the girl and told her to eat it quickly. Blanche looked at the cake very seriously. And then her cheeks turned red, and the girl smiled and said that it was okay, she would eat it, and then she thanked Her Majesty. Abigail looked at her and wondered how Civilian could hate such an adorable little child. She was sure that this happened because he had never seen her like this. But she could have just shown him, couldn't she? Abigail's thoughts turned to Civilian, and they were black and malicious. She will make this callous man regret ignoring such kindness for so long. At this time, Civilian was standing at the window of his office and leafing through the pages of a large book. He thought that it had been a long time since he had had time to take a break. He looked down at the page again. Suddenly he was distracted by a knock on the door. He thought that Milord had come again and ordered him to come in. The door creaked cautiously. Abigail walked slowly into the office and stopped. Civilian asked what had happened this time. Well, the words were hesitant and Civilian looked up. Abigail guessed she must have been in the way. Civilian was surprised to see the Queen here. He slammed shut the book he was reading. Then he turned to Abigail and asked her to sit down first. He prepared to listen to her carefully, and Abigail said that, in fact, she had a request. Abigail looked straight at Civilian and looked wary. He asked what the request was. Abigail said that from now on he would dine with Princess Blanche once a day, as she would like it. Civilian thought that she was talking about Blanche again, but he wondered out loud what the need was for shared meals, considering that the princess was no longer a small child. And then he said something that made Abigail angry again. He declared that he was not going to indulge the childish whims of the future heir to the throne. Abigail could not believe that he was serious. She jumped up and exclaimed that these were not whims. She just wanted to strengthen the relationship between father and daughter, and this very father infuriated her so much. Civilian looked at her distorted face. Relationships, he said as if in thought. He asked Abigail why he needed all this. Abigail wasn't surprised in her opinion. It was a natural question for this man, to whom she would now have to explain that he and his daughter were one family. Civilian repeated her words again thoughtfully, and agreed that they were indeed a family. He admitted that he still didn't understand how sharing meals was connected to their family relationship, but he had heard that Abigail now often ate with the princess. However, he still did not understand why he had to join these meals. Abigail replied with irritation that it was because he was Blanche's father. Civilian thought about these words. Abigail noted out loud that her offer did not mean that she would sit at the table with her daughter and father. She had already said that Civilian didn't have to play the role of her husband. He just needed to be a real father, that's all, and the father and daughter would get along just fine without her. Civilian remembered this. He looked up and looked closely at the Queen. Abigail realized it was a failure. Civilian asked her what she meant by the role of a husband, and she couldn't immediately find the words to answer, stumbling and not finishing her sentences. She finally managed to say something about showing affection. She also meant everything related to bed and things like that. Then Civilian asked how the Queen had come to the point where she no longer desired his attention. Such a direct question caught Abigail off guard. But Civilian looked at her, clearly intending to wait for an answer, and Abigail muttered something halting and uncertain. She even had to close her eyes from the intense gaze. Unable to bear it any longer, she jumped up and screamed that she was not his wife. Or rather, she very clearly imagined herself doing it, because she wanted to do it so much. Meanwhile, Civilian asked her directly if she had taken a lover. "I'm sorry," Abigail said, confused, as if she had heard him wrong. Civilian replied that he would neither reproach nor hinder if the Queen wished to bring him as a favorite, and if she becomes pregnant, he will accept this child as his own. Civilian began to explain that this seemed to him to be a profitable arrangement, but he didn't even manage to finish the sentence because he shuddered. The sound of Abigail's nails ripping through the upholstery of the chair where the Queen sat was unexpectedly loud. Abigail was simply indescribably furious at everything she had just heard. Could it be that this man really said exactly what she just heard? Civilian, looking at her, shuddered. Abigail was now trying her best to avoid any shameful situation for herself. She drowned out her deep loneliness with the pride and self-love befitting a royal family. Favorite, she cried. She could not understand who this man took her for, and yet Abigail's memories still lived in this body. She exclaimed that even if her marriage to Civilian was just a cover, she was still his wife and the queen of this country, so he simply had no right to insult her like that. Abigail jumped up with a bang, slamming her palms down on the surface of the tea table. Civilian did not dare to suggest such a thing so frivolously, and especially to his own wife, broken by despair from the fact that she could only watch him from afar. He now seemed to her a real scumbag. Abigail sighed, glaring at Civilian. Civilian lowered his head and said what slipped out of his mouth he had made too many mistakes in relation to the queen lately. He covered his face with his hand and asked for forgiveness for his lack of restraint. This sudden capitulation shocked Abigail and made her freeze. She said that she was ready to forgive him if he fulfilled her request today. Civilian asked if she meant the meal. Abigail, having managed to pull herself together, smiled, and Civilian said that he agreed. He immediately added that every day was too often and would greatly disrupt his own schedule, so he suggested reducing these meetings to once a month. Abigail considered this change. Then she said that she agreed to once every 3 days. Civilian suggested once every 2 weeks. 3 days, Abigail repeated. Civilian suggested once every 10 days, but the queen was adamant and insisted on once every 3 days. Civilian covered his face with his hand again. "Queen, this is a bit," he muttered and did not finish the sentence. Abigail had the determined and fierce look of a warrior in the heat of battle, confident in her perseverance. Civilian's questioning gaze was directed at her. Then he laughed at the associations it evoked in him. Abigail didn't understand what he found funny about all this. Civilian sighed and replied that nothing. "Okay," Civilian agreed. He was ready to dine with Blanche once every 3 days, as the queen wanted. But he wanted her to be present at these dinners as well. Abigail didn't expect this. She asked why she had to eat with them every 3 days. Civilian replied that if she was not happy with that, they could forget about the idea of eating together. Abigail quickly said that she was happy with everything. Everything was fine. Civilian said that their negotiations were then completed. He only asked to be informed of a specific date. "Okay," Abigail replied with a chuckle. But if that wasn't too much of audacity on her part, Abigail wanted to ask one more thing. "What is it?" Civilian asked irritably. "Well, Abigail muttered hesitantly. She said the king had avoided intimacy with her and kept Princess Blanche at a distance because of the late queen." "What?" Civilian asked again, perplexed. Abigail replied that she had heard that he loved his first wife very much. But she still thought it was too cruel of Civilian to distance himself from the princess because of this. It wasn't the girl's fault, Abigail wanted to say, but Civilian didn't let her finish. He said that she was now talking complete nonsense and asked who had told her all this. "What did he say?" Abigail said, not understanding. Civilian said he wanted to know who told her about his love for the previous queen. Abigail then said that it seemed the rumors were completely false, as was evident from the overly serious expression on the king's face. Verite, to whom she told this story, asked what happened next. Abigail replied that she had immediately inquired about the real reason for Civilian's indifference to Blanche. But Civilian replied that she simply knew nothing about parental love. That's exactly what he told her, and yet he had such a cute daughter that Abigail simply couldn't understand how her own child could not be touching. No, she couldn't figure it out at all, nor could she understand why the queen's place had been empty for so many years. Verite replied that it would have been possible to ask Civilian directly about this. With a sigh, Abigail admitted that the atmosphere at the time was not the most suitable. He just looked like he was feeling unwell. Verite noticed that he had heard a couple of rumors from the palace. They could be clues to the reason. But it was a rather unpleasant story, and he asked if the queen still wanted to hear it. "Oh, of course!" Abigail exclaimed enthusiastically. Besides, she wondered how Verite could have heard these rumors if he was only in this room. Verite explained that he could, in fact, move freely anywhere as long as there was a mirror there. This simply amazed Abigail. It turns out that all this time her mirror friend had such a unique ability. She asked if he could record what he saw, then he could be a real security camera. Verite could have done it, of course, but he didn't understand what security cameras were. But Abigail told him not to focus on it, but asked him to share the rumors with her. Verite reminded her that Abigail had often heard people call Civilian extremely cold-blooded and dispassionate. This was because he had personally imprisoned his mother, after which he became indifferent, so such rumors had a completely understandable basis. Abigail had indeed heard something like this before. It seems he threw her into prison on suspicion of conspiracy she was going to overthrow him from the throne. This was when the queen began to actively interfere in politics and build up military power. However, Abigail would not have called Civilian so dispassionate, but she had already heard the story with his mother, and now she wanted to know if there was anything else. Verite replied that the rumor was not pleasant, but there were rumors that Blanche might not be his daughter at all. The astonished Abigail exclaimed that the queen could not possibly be having an affair on the side. "Oh," she blurted out. My God, she really was fearless. Verite said there was no evidence of betrayal, it was nothing more than a rumor. But something like this could well have been the reason for Civilian's hatred towards Blanche. Moreover, it was said that after the incident with the queen, he spent more than 10 years alone due to his distrust of women. If this was true, then everything was very logical. But no matter how you look at it, Blanche was a copy of Civilian, as if he himself had given birth to her. If someone had told Abigail this, she would not have even doubted it. But there was someone else who had similar traits to them. "Someone else, really?" Abigail muttered. Verite explained that he was talking about Raven. Abigail thought it was just some kind of soap opera in which the wife was having an affair with her brother from another mother. She was completely crazy. She would never have thought about the Queen and Raven, whom she had seen a couple of times at public events. Verite was quick to remind her that he could not say that this was true. It was nothing more than rumors. And since these rumors concerned the long-dead Queen, there was no way to find out the truth. The only way was to beat a confession out of Raven. But Abigail knew he would deny everything, no matter whether the rumors were true or not. She cried out that now she simply did not understand what to do with the relationship between Civilian and Blanche. If all this was true, then their relationship could only be improved if Civilian were a saint. Verite asked her to calm down. This was still completely inaccurate information. It wouldn't hurt her to try to find out the details herself. Abigail asked how she could do that, and Verite reminded her that all the mirrors in the palace were his eyes. He could see Civilian in his office at his desk, covered with piles of papers. In the mirror surface, Verite could show this picture to Abigail herself. She pressed her face close to the mirror, surprised that she could see it so clearly. Verite replied that if she observed Civilian through the mirror, perhaps she would gradually be able to learn the whole truth about him. "It's so," Abigail said sadly. Verite didn't understand what exactly she didn't like. Abigail asked him if he ever thought about the feelings of someone being watched like that. She expressed the hope that he didn't watch her like that. Verite replied that no, he respected other people's privacy. He agreed with her that they wouldn't use that method, but he didn't understand what Abigail was going to do next. She suggested that she could try asking Civilian directly later. Verite asked if she was stupid. Abigail screamed that she knew everything. He wouldn't tell her anything. She knew everything perfectly well. She said thoughtfully that this should be found out personally only from them. Verite responded to this with a meaningful silence. To begin with, they will watch and observe the atmosphere when they spend time together. Abigail didn't want to sit down at the same table with Civilian, but there was no other way out. She had to take this step. In the kitchen, they were diligently preparing for the appointed dinner. All the servants were very busy with their duties. The head chef shouted at his subordinates, demanding that the preparation of dishes for His Majesty and the princess go smoothly. "Yes, everything is in perfect order," the workers answered him. The head chef reminded them that they had to do everything perfectly, as this was the Queen's order. She said that His Majesty and the princess would be dining together, so everyone should try especially hard, and they had better cook everything perfectly. All the kitchen staff were very nervous now. When it was time to serve the main course, the head chef shouted for everyone to hurry up. "And don't forget what I told you," he shouted at the pink-haired maid's back. "Hey, can you hear me?" It sounded so loud that the girl flinched. "Yes," she responded, and exclaimed that she would give everything right away. The girl was simply run off her feet in this commotion. She quickly rolled the cart with dishes down the corridor. She didn't expect to meet a man along the way. The maid recognized the man and became frightened. "You're taking a long time," said Madame Jeremy, beckoning her with her finger, asking her to be quieter. The girl asked with fear if everything would really be okay. Madame Jeremy assured her that, of course, how could it be otherwise? The maid would certainly not suffer any harm from all this. Madame Jeremy thought of Abigail, who dared to shame her while she herself was not fulfilling her duties as a queen. She's just going to put things back the way they were. Everything has been calm lately, but one tiny mistake will cause all trust in the Queen to collapse in an instant. The maid asked Madame Jeremy to do everything quickly because she needed to serve the dish before it got cold. Madame Jeremy looked at the cart again and thought that this more modest dish should be intended for a princess. That's where she poured everything from the pepper jar. She winced just a little as she looked at what she was doing. And then, with a characteristic sound, she opened the lid on the jar she had brought with her. She also poured the contents of this jar onto the plate. The maid who was watching this was also trembling. Madame Jeremy told her to serve this dish to the princess. The maid asked what Madame had just sprinkled on it. Madame Jeremy replied that it was merely to regulate the princess's appetite and there was nothing to worry about. She handed the jar to the maid and offered to try it if she wanted. The maid opened the jar and shook it over her own palm, and then she put a pinch of what she had sprinkled into her mouth. "Oh, that's it," she exclaimed, recognizing the taste. Madame Jeremy told her to hurry, otherwise all the dishes would get cold. The maid continued on her way, and Madame Jeremy watched her go. She hid exactly the same bottle in the queen's room, and the first thing they will suspect of what happened will be her, of course. Yes, it will only cause a little commotion. The maid set out new dishes. The royal family sat sedately at the laid table. Blanche's joyful eyes sparkled brightly with delight. The maid glanced sideways at the dish that Madame Jeremy had ordered to be served to the princess. From the outside, nothing unusual was noticeable about him. The maid knew it was just a regular spice, so everything should be fine. Blanche prepared to try a piece. "Wait a second," Abigail's voice suddenly rang out. She said that it looked like they had simply mixed up her and the princess's plates. Civilian asked what was wrong, and she replied that nothing special. Abigail explained that she simply didn't like asparagus, and so asked not to serve it to her. The maid remembered that the chef had told her something about this. She should have remembered that the plate without asparagus was for Her Majesty. Abigail said they could now start eating before the food got cold. The instruments began to ring. For some time, the dinner passed in silence. Abigail watched the girl with a smile. Civilian didn't even look at anyone, as if he was alone here, and only on Blanche's face did emotional expressions change. The maid who brought the dinner breathed a sigh of relief. Thank God nothing happened. Abigail thought it was as expected from a chef. The spices were stronger this time, but it was still cooked to perfection, as always. However, she should soon put down her fork. She needs to control herself. Lately her dresses have become too tight for her, so she will have to go on a diet. She, of course, told Blanche that figure was not important at all. She herself was still afraid. Only beautiful people had the right to say that the inner world, not appearance, was most important. That was how it was in the world of her past life. If she said something like that, she would only be laughed at. She's damn lucky to be reborn in the body of such a beauty, but she might gain the weight again. And then everyone will start looking at her like that again. Abigail sighed heavily. As a result, although her appearance was now different, she still could not change even a little from the time when she criticized herself because of the opinions of others, strangers to her. Suddenly she thought that now was the planned time for tea and casual conversation. This sullen goat just drank tea silently and did nothing else. Apparently, Abigail herself had to diffuse this heavy atmosphere. She exclaimed that the princess looked great in her dress, and then asked if His Majesty liked the outfit. She drew Civilian's attention to how lovely Blanche looked. Civilian glanced sideways at the girl and said that she was truly lovely. Abigail said that Blanche always looked cute, but today she was especially charming. It even seemed to her that the girl had thin wings behind her back, like a fairy from a fairy tale. Abigail couldn't believe her eyes at what the wings could be. She rubbed her eyes with her fists to drive away the obsession. Civilian asked if something had happened to the queen. Those were definitely wings, but no, she probably just imagined it. It was strange. My head was spinning a little, and that was the mood. Abigail thought the mood was high and blushed. This internal monologue went on for too long. Her interlocutors began to ask if everything was okay with her. Blanche asked if everything was okay with her, and the wings behind her back opened again. Abigail looked at her, completely amazed by this picture. She said Blanche was just as charming as ever. She exclaimed that Blanche was a cutie yesterday, a cutie today, and a cutie tomorrow. Just as she had expected, their Blanche was a fairy. "She's such a cutie, isn't she?" Abigail said, sounding completely moved. Civilian looked at her with alarm, but said out loud that Blanche really was nice. Abigail asked him to repeat it one more time. "I think she's cute," Civilian said again. Abigail, in response to this, suddenly jumped up and exclaimed that, that's right, their Princess Blanche was the sweetest in the world, and she also had a heart of gold. Then she sat back down and said that she had gone through so many hardships, and it must have been very difficult to endure that at such a young age. Blanche looked at her almost frightened. Abigail angrily turned to Civilian and asked why he didn't give love to such a lovely daughter. He just needed to look at her. The girl was a real fairy. She even had wings. Civilian wondered if she really hadn't drunk anything alcoholic, since she was acting exactly like she was drunk, but even for a drunk, her behavior was too strange. Abigail said that if she were His Majesty, she would hold Blanche on her lap every day. She asked the princess to come closer to them. Blanche jumped up and said that she was already coming. The girl started running towards her. Abigail picked the girl up in her arms and held her close. Just a minute for the little one," Abigail cried, laughing and getting her words and thoughts confused. Blanche's blue eyes looked at her with amazement, and it was so beautiful. Abigail told the girl that she was simply unbearably adorable, and even tears welled up in her eyes from affection. Civilian did not understand why all this was happening, and he was especially surprised by the Queen's tears. Abigail said that she would also like Blanche to like her back. She didn't know at all what to do for this. After all, Blanche was the most beautiful girl in the world. Abigail went on and on about how Blanche was so cute, and the bunnies were cute, and the cuteness was the bunnies, and the cuteness was Blanche. At that moment, even the girl realized that something was wrong with Her Majesty. "Oh my God, I have a fairy in my hands!" Abigail exclaimed, and Civilian realized that he was mistaken. The Queen had clearly reached the stage where she didn't even hear what was said to her. "Blanche, come here," said Civilian and winked at the girl. "Okay," said Blanche, still hugged by Abigail. When she approached him, Civilian ordered the servants to take the princess to her room and bring the court physician, and Abigail screamed for her fairy not to leave. The trusted servant bowed and left to carry out the assignment. "Queen, how are you?" Civilian asked Abigail. Abigail muttered that of course she was perfectly fine. Everything was fine. Civilian saw that she was not at all okay. He leaned over her to examine her condition. Abigail's eyes were such a pure violet color. The Queen's hands reached out to Civilian's face. Civilian couldn't understand what was going on at all. Abigail's fingers cupped his face and she looked into his eyes. Her parted lips suddenly seemed so close. The distance between their faces became smaller and smaller. "No, don't come closer," the thought flashed through my mind. "Hey, my friend, stop living like this," Abigail cried and slapped him on the cheek with all her might. Then she squeezed it with both hands. She asked if he thought he could do anything just because he was hot-blooded, that he would be forgiven for tearing apart the rabbit just because of his pretty face. He had no idea how much effort Abigail had spent on that toy. She called Civilian an evil bastard. Was he allowed to do everything just because he was a king? Abigail asked what was so difficult about sharing a meal with a child. If they had never eaten together, he must have realized that he had made a big mistake, but they were still a family. Civilian exclaimed that the Queen had gone too far. With a heavy sigh, Abigail said that it would be so wonderful if she and Blanche finally got along. Some papers fell to the floor with a loud sound. The man who brought them froze on the threshold in utter amazement. "Your Majesty, are you all right?" he shouted, rushing between the king and queen. Civilian replied that he was fine, but a doctor still needed to be brought. Soon the doctor ran into the room, asking who had become ill. "First, it was necessary to take the queen to her bedchamber," Civilian replied. Abigail heard these orders and her face darkened. She stood up unsteadily and declared that she would get there on her own. But everything was swimming before her eyes, and the floor was shaking under her feet. Abigail didn't understand what was happening. For some reason, her head was spinning so much. She seemed to be losing consciousness. "Queen," she heard, plunging into oblivion, and managed to think that this is how she would die again. She heard such an insistent voice nearby. They were calling her Majesty, persuading her to hold on. She did not understand who needed her so much to call her so anxiously. She even really wanted to see who it was, but her eyelids suddenly became too heavy. "That's not the point at all," someone's voice said, and another voice replied that Her Majesty would soon recover. Abigail finally managed to open her eyes. There was a throbbing in her head, as if she had a hangover, although she didn't remember drinking the night before. She remembered having lunch with Blanche and Civilian, and then she hugged Blanche and said some incoherent nonsense to her. Then she grabbed Civilian's face and asked if he thought he could do anything because he was hot-blooded, that she would forgive him for tearing the rabbit to shreds because he had a pretty face. "Oh shit," Abigail thought. "I just wanted to scream. She's out of her mind if she did something like that. Now let her just die." But Civilian was there and asked if the Queen had come to her senses. Abigail lay in her bed, with Civilian and the doctor standing next to her. She thought that at this rate she could be executed or exiled. She probably needed to beg for mercy. She tried to cry and began to repent of having committed a mortal sin, but Civilian replied that everything was fine and asked her to lie back down. She continued to cry, and this is where she will lie until her execution. Civilian assured that he knew that the Queen was not herself then, so she should not worry. Even she would not have said such a thing if she had been in her right mind. Abigail felt like those words were offensive to her, but it was still better to have at least that kind of reaction. She sank down onto the pillows and said that she was asking for forgiveness. She herself did not understand what had come over her. Civilian explained that it was all about the food she ate. During the investigation, too much nutmeg was found in the queen's plate. Abigail objected that nutmeg was a very common spice. The doctor replied that this is usually the case, but that consuming large amounts of nutmeg can cause side effects. Typically, they include dizziness, overexcitement, a feeling of intoxication, hallucinations, and incoherent delusional speech. "Just think," Abigail muttered, "it all happened because of some poor nutmeg." She looked at Civilian's darkened face. He stated that he had decided to execute the chef a week later, whether it was a mistake or not, but he had harmed a member of the royal family. Abigail jumped up with a scream. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. The execution was clearly too much. It was just a simple oversight. She asked Civilian to soften the sentence. Abigail's heart was pounding wildly, throbbing in her temples. Civilian asked if she didn't understand that this man had harmed the queen, and no punishment could be too severe. Abigail replied that perhaps he did not do it on purpose, since everything was fine with her, so she asked His Majesty to have mercy, since she would be very sad if he executed the chef because of this incident. "Okay," Civilian agreed and decided to temporarily postpone the punishment. Abigail breathed a sigh of relief. Thank God the cook's head was saved. Civilian said that Blanche wished to see Her Majesty. Abigail was very surprised. Civilian asked if the princess should be allowed in, and Abigail, blushing, nodded her head. Quick footsteps were heard. Blanche was running and calling for Her Majesty. The girl anxiously asked if the queen was okay, if she was very ill and in pain. Abigail replied that she was fine now. She asked the girl for forgiveness for behaving so indecently with her. She was now sincerely sorry, because Blanche was probably scared. Blanche said everything was fine, but she wanted to know something. Abigail asked what had happened to the princess. Blushing and embarrassed, Blanche said that she wanted to know if it was true that Her Majesty liked her. Abigail thought that her fan nature had finally been revealed. "Yes, that's true," she answered with a smile. Blanche beamed with joy. She said that she had one request then. This request could wait until Her Majesty had fully recovered. Blanche asked if Abigail could go for a walk with her. Abigail happily agreed and assured that she would recover very soon. She thought that she was even grateful for this illness, which had turned out this way. The doctor noted that Her Majesty had only recently woken up, so it would be better for her to remain in bed for a few days. Her head was indeed splitting, but Abigail tried not to show it and assured that she was fine, that being with the princess cleared her mind, and her head almost didn't hurt. Civilian noticed how she winced in pain and firmly said that it was better for her to rest, and that he and Blanche would leave now. Blanche bowed and said that then Her Majesty should rest as well as possible. "Ah," Abigail said, trying again to reassure him that she was perfectly fine. But the door closed behind the visitors, and all that was left was to watch them go with tears in their eyes. Oh, Civilian was so slow-witted and completely useless. She began to think that nutmeg was such a dangerous spice, and that her head really did hurt, and maybe she really should rest a little. "Hey, are you alive there?" A voice suddenly rang out, and at first it scared her. It was Verite, and Abigail had to get up again. "Bibi, how are you feeling?" asked Verite, who was reflected in a small mirror that lay on the dressing table. Abigail took the mirror in her hands and replied that she was feeling quite tolerable now, and then she was amazed at the capabilities of her mirror friend. It turns out he can do this too. Verite replied that his great powers were of no use anyway, since he couldn't even help her avoid that fall. Abigail said that she was very grateful to him for his concern, but now that she was really okay, Verite asked in what sense she considered it good, since she almost died. This surprised Abigail very much. She even asked him again what he meant. Verite said that if you eat too much nutmeg, you can die or fall into a coma or go blind. "What?" Abigail screamed in horror. Verite explained that everything had ended up the way it had only happened because Abigail was an adult. But if little Blanche had eaten a similar dose, she really could have died. Abigail realized that Blanche had almost eaten that dish. The chef had to be fired because such a mistake could not be ignored. Verite countered that such measures would be useless because the chef had nothing to do with it. Abigail asked Verite if she knew anything about it, and then asked him to tell her everything and not leave out any details. At this time, in another room, another woman was breaking something in anger. Madame Jeremy learned that the queen had eaten the meat, and she was shaking with rage at the thought that such a wonderful plan had failed. At that moment there was a knock on the door. Madame Jeremy allowed the maid to enter and immediately asked irritably what was wrong. The maid reported that Her Majesty was looking for the former governess. Madame Jeremy threw down the thing she had been tormenting in her hands all this time. Could it really have all been like this? She thought. But no, this slow-witted girl simply couldn't know anything apparently. She needed some trifle. So Madame Jeremy came to the royal chambers without any particular worries. Bowing humbly, the woman asked why Her Majesty had summoned her. The Queen's gaze made her shudder. "Greetings, Madame Jeremy," said Abigail. She asked gloomily if she knew why she had been called here. This terrifying contempt of hers was immediately felt. Madame Jeremy understood that she must not lose her composure. "No, I don't know," Madame Jeremy replied. In high society, it was like being at war, and she was already a veteran there. People like her weren't so easily broken. Abigail said she knew she had put nutmeg in Blanche's food, so there was no point in continuing to pretend she hadn't done anything. Madame Jeremy wondered if the Queen knew everything, but then she realized that Abigail just wanted to feel her out. "I knew you hated me," she said with tears in her eyes. She said that she still did not expect such terrible and unfair accusations. This, indeed, was too much. She cried out and burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. Abigail watched this emotional scene in silence, and then she told Clara to bring that girl, and Madame Jeremy turned to the door. Clara brought a maid from the palace kitchen, the very girl Her Majesty had spoken of. The maid was very frightened, especially when she saw Madame Jeremy here. Madame Jeremy, looking at her, thought that this girl had betrayed her, but it was not so bad. Everything would be over if she continued to bend her line. She asked Her Majesty who the girl was, and then declared that she was seeing her for the first time. "Funny," Abigail said, then recalled how Madame Jeremy had added nutmeg to a dish right next to her. Madame Jeremy exclaimed that she really knew nothing about it. She began to cry again and lamented that it wasn't enough for the Queen to remove her from her position as the princess's governess. She thought that if Abigail had any material evidence, she would have already told the king everything, and since there was none, no one could punish Madame Jeremy if she continued to deny everything. "Okay," Abigail said, adding that it all looked very strange indeed. She agreed that it did seem like it was someone else, and then opened the lid of the box with a click. There was a mirror in the box, in which Madame Jeremy saw her own reflection with bewilderment. She asked what it was. "I just want to put everything back to normal," a voice said. "Please hurry up, Madame Jeremy," came from the mirror, where instead of a reflection one could now see both the maid with the cart and the one who was waiting for her in the corridor. The maid insisted on speed, because if she did not serve the dish on time, it would get cold beyond repair. It was also clear who exactly added the spices to the dish. "Serve this dish to the princess," she said then. Horrified by the scene before her, Madame Jeremy fell to her knees before the mirror and the Queen. Abigail said that if she had anything to say in her defense, she could speak now. Madame Jeremy begged for mercy, kneeling before Abigail. She burst into tears and said that she had just naively wanted to get her position as governess back, so she decided to create a little commotion. Abigail glared at her and stood up to come closer. She grabbed Madame Jeremy's chin and tilted her face back to look into his. "A little commotion," Abigail repeated furiously, and Madame Jeremy replied that she had only wanted to make the princess a little dizzy. Abigail squeezed her face so hard that Madame Jeremy begged for mercy, saying it hurt. "It hurts, you say, because of such nonsense!" Abigail screamed, beside herself with anger. How could this woman say such a thing, when because of her pampering Blanche could die? That amount of nutmeg would have made even an adult, Abigail herself, lose consciousness, and if a child had consumed such a dose, how could it have ended with a simple fainting spell? A cold-blooded attempt on the life of a member of the royal family can in no way be called a simple commotion. It can't be, thought Madame Jeremy, because the pharmacist told her something completely different. After all, she definitely asked him if there were any side effects it was impossible to allow a person to die, so the amount needed was only enough to make him faint. The pharmacist explained to her how much was usually enough for this. But she forgot to specify that this dose was for the child. That's where the mistake was made. Abigail said that, on the one hand, she even felt sorry for her. Madame Jeremy was completely entrusted with the upbringing of the princess, and then the Queen suddenly appeared and turned everything upside down. She understood perfectly well that for the governess, she was like a thorn in the side, perhaps. If she had become the original target for her in this assassination attempt, she would even have forgiven her. But Madame Jeremy dared to do this to a child to whom she had replaced a mother for 10 years. Madame Jeremy, horrified, continued to beg for mercy. Abigail released her face from her hands and pushed her away from her. She said that Madame Jeremy had only 3 options. The first was to voluntarily surrender to His Majesty and tell him everything. The second was that Abigail herself would report everything to the king. The lady asked in horror about the third. "To die here and now by my hand," Abigail said meaningfully. Your Majesty, said Clara, rubbing her shoulders in the evening in her room. The maid wanted to tell her the news that Madame Jeremy had been sent to prison. Of course, Abigail already knew about this. That day, Madame Jeremy decided to voluntarily surrender to the king, apparently thinking that this would mitigate her sentence. But despite all her futile efforts, Civilian was adamant. Of course, he ordered her execution. No matter how they tried to hide it from Blanche, nothing came of it. As a result, Blanche sent Civilian a letter with a tearful request for clemency, and it was decided to send Madame Jeremy to hard labor. But just in case, Abigail also recorded the scene of Madame Jeremy's maid hiding nutmeg in her room, although she, of course, could not do any more stupid things since the rumors had already spread so much. Abigail asked if the chef had returned to his post. Clara replied that they said yes. The maid reminded that today was the day of Her Majesty's walk with Princess Blanche. Abigail became agitated and ordered them to get ready to go out immediately because they couldn't keep the princess waiting, so they had to hurry. Soon, Abigail was running down the path, enjoying how fresh the air was. She arrived half an hour early and was already trembling all over, and her heart was beating desperately. The little Princess Fox must have felt exactly the same. Suddenly, Abigail heard some rustling in the bushes. She thought there might be a cat there. She decided to check what was there, but it turned out not to be a cat at all. Abigail called out to Princess Blanche, but she was startled by the unexpectedness. Then the girl realized that it was Her Majesty, and was glad that she had also arrived earlier. Abigail asked what the girl herself was doing here so early. Blanche was visibly embarrassed by this question. Then she hid her face and handed Abigail the bouquet she had been hiding behind her back. Was this really for her? Abigail was amazed. Yes, Blanche replied, explaining that these flowers were as beautiful as Her Majesty, so she wanted to be sure to give them to her. Abigail just didn't know what to do. She was ready to burst into tears from emotion. She thanked the princess. The flowers were indeed very beautiful. Blanche tugged at Abigail's skirt, wanting to tell her something. She whispered in her ear that the queen had then told her that she liked her, and this made her very happy, because she too had long wanted to be friends with her. Blanche bowed and thanked Her Majesty for walking with her.